Hey there. Tonight we're exploring why it sucked to be a cowboy on a cattle drive. Not the Hollywood version you know, mostly dust, beans, and black coffee, saddle sores, and quiet songs on night guard to keep the herd calm. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now find your comfort zone, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's venture into tonight's story together. You swing into the saddle, expecting romance, and ride straight into a face full of ammonia-scented dust. That smell follows you for months, because you are moving 2,000 to 3,000 half-wild longhorns up the trail, and every one of them treats the ground like a public restroom. The posters promised sunsets and campfire songs. The brochure forgot to mention the 18-hour days, the 1,000-mile commute at 2 miles per hour, and the way your lungs start to feel like you've been chain-smoking the prairie. Here's the uncomfortable headline the dime novels skipped. Being a cowboy on a late 1860s cattle drive is mostly boredom, filth, and terror, in that order. The pay floats between $25 and $40 a month for a regular hand in the 1870s. Maybe $75 if you're the cook, a little over $100 if you're the trail boss, and the money shows up only at the end, if the boss feels honest and the market doesn't crater before you hit the railhead. According to the Kansas State Historical Society and old-timer accounts compiled by the Texas State Historical Association, those numbers aren't internet legend. That's the going rate for turning your spine into a question mark and your wardrobe into a dust filter. The timeline sets the stage. From 1866 to about 1886, after the Civil War blew Texas ranching apart, you and tens of thousands like you shove somewhere around 10 million longhorns north to railheads in Kansas, Nebraska, and beyond. Joseph McCoy builds stockyards at Abilene in 1867 and basically tells the railroads and the markets, send the buyers here, we'll bring the beef. The Chisholm Trail, the Goodnight Loving, the Western Trail, they're not theme park names. They're scars carved across the plains by hooves and wagon wheels. You ride in a crew of maybe a dozen cowhands, one cook with the chuck wagon, and one wrangler wrangling a remuda of 100 or more horses. One person per 200 to 300 cattle is a workable ratio if everyone does not fall asleep at once, which would be bold because the longhorns don't sleep well and the weather has zero sense of humor. You cover 10 to 15 miles on a good day because cattle are not sports cars and grass grows at a speed that mocks ambition. You feel the romance at dawn for exactly 14 seconds. Then the dust, the flies, the dew-soaked socks, and the tiny stabbing mesquite thorns remind you that the West is not your Instagram feed. The cook rattles pans around, 3:30 a.m. You roll out of a bedroll stiff as ship's canvas and stuff down Arbuckle's coffee boiled until it could dissolve cutlery. Sourdough biscuits punched awake from a jar of starter that rode over every rock in Texas, and beans that double as both protein and social distancing tool. Charles Goodnight's chuck wagon, first rigged in 1866, keeps this whole machine alive. A mobile kitchen with a hinged box slung underneath called an opossum belly, for Dutch ovens and wood, a flour barrel, dried fruit if you got lucky in the last town, and salt pork that tastes like a dare. Smithsonian curated exhibits on the chuck wagon indulge you with the eye candy. The historical reality indulges you with heartburn. Before the sun cracks the horizon, you split into positions that sound heroic and feel like cardio punishment. Upper point. 2 of you are the guidance counselors of bovine chaos, keeping the lead steers aimed at grass and water. On swing and flank, you bend the line, nudge stragglers, and head off anything with a bad idea. Back at drag, you inhale every atom the herd kicked up since sunrise. Dried manure, alkali dust, pulverized grass, and wear it as a face mask nature never approved. Historians like Ramon Adams, in The Old-Time Cowhand, loved noting how the drag rider coughs black paste at night. The documentary poetry of that detail hides nothing. The Longhorns do not treat you like a movie hero. These aren't feedlot heifers raised on handshakes. Texas Longhorns, descended from Spanish cattle brought to the Americas in the 1500s, are rangy, fast, and often about as tame as a thrown lasso. A mature longhorn wears horns that can spread 4 to 5 feet, and a temperament that says, "Please stop pretending I am your pet." You push a river of horns and hooves that drinks like a bar at closing time. One thirsty steer can suck down 10 to 15 gallons of water in a day, when it can find any, and your job is steering thousands of those canteens toward creeks that may or may not exist this week. Quicksand at the Canadian River, a blue norther screaming down the panhandle, lightning turning the prairie into a strobe light. These are recurring features, not Easter eggs. The horses underneath you carry half the story. You rotate mounts, switching through the remuda so no single animal collapses. That remuda, usually 100 to 150 horses for a typical trail crew, is worth more than your entire wardrobe and maybe your life. They're not show ponies. They're half-broke Mustangs, tough little Spanish-descended cow horses, the kind that put up with cactus, step into rivers without a press release, and still try to unload you if you slouch. The wrangler's job is keeping that equine horde together with a bell mare that everybody recognizes, because horses follow the prom queen. You throw a heavy stock saddle, Texas style, deep seat, high cantle, on your day's mount, cinch until the gelding looks offended, and tie a slicker behind the cantle, because storms play by their own calendar. The saddle alone weighs 30 to 40 pounds. The hat shading your eyes might be a Stetson Boss of the Plains, first sold in 1865, or something cheaper. But the brim earns its keep. The bandana around your neck is not a fashion statement. It's a dust mask, a water filter, and a first aid kit that also stops nosebleeds and wraps blistered hands. The gear leaks Spanish from every seam, chaps from chaparreras, lariat from the reata, rodeo from rodeo to round up. Vaquero becomes buckaroo in parts of the West, because language whittles words like it whittles sticks. Your style is an American remix of Mexican ranching traditions. And the Smithsonian, the National Cowboy Museum, and the Texas State Historical Association all keep repeating that because Hollywood kept forgetting. Everything that actually works, from the spurs' gentle cues to the rigging of your saddle, grew out of centuries of horsework south of the Rio Grande. The crew around you is not a Marlboro ad. White, black, and Mexican hands ride shoulder to shoulder, plus a good number of native cowboys in different regions. Historians peg the proportion of black cowboys at roughly 1 in 4, sometimes a bit more. Oza Card, born around 1843, rode with Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving, and earned an epitaph from Goodnight that still makes people pause. Nat Love, born in 1854, wrote a rollicking memoir in 1907 about his trail life, stretching a few yarns, but capturing a truth that stares out of crew photos from the 1870s. Tejano vaqueros teach knots and stock sense that keep greenhorns out of their own graves. The job pays the same low wages to most, but railhead saloons do not treat everyone equally, and the legend tends to crop faces it doesn't want to print. You push north, because the math says so. In post-war Texas, longhorns breed like ideas and sell for $4 a head. In Chicago or the slaughterhouses of Kansas City, that same steer can earn $30 to $40. Run 2,500 up the trail and lose a few dozen to rivers, lightning, and misadventure, and the investors still clap. Joseph G. McCoy spells out the economics in his 1874 book, Historic Sketches of the Cattle Trade of the West and Southwest. The path squeezes you through Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, where tribes sometimes collect tolls or sell grazing rights on reservation land as your herd passes by. Especially along the Cherokee Outlet by the 1880s, you ride past army forts that exist because the U.S. government fought a long, brutal war for the plains. By 1875, Quanah Parker and the last large Comanche band surrender, and the army posts turn more to policing the routes than fighting for them. The political reality sits right under your saddle, even if you spend most of your attention on not flipping upside down in the Washita. Your night shifts feel like a dare the sky wrote. 2 hours on, 2 hours off, turning in slow circles around 1,000 sleeping steers, whose dreams sound like thunder clearing its throat. You sing to keep them calm, because a voice plus a horse moving steady beats silence and heartbeat baseball. The playlist is folk soup, the old Chisholm Trail, Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie, Streets of Laredo in various forms. The Smithsonian Folkways Catalogue lists versions that took shape in this era, and old-timers kept the lyrics moving like the herd. You do not belt perfect harmonies. You mutter and hum and repeat, because repetition quiets cattle the way it quiets babies. It also keeps you from noticing your boots are still wet from the river, or the way lightning is counting the miles straight to you. The stampede arrives without a monologue, a far-off crack of thunder, a hat gusting over the lead steers, a stray jackrabbit exploding under a hoof. 1 second you see 1,000 backs, like oil swells on a still ocean. The next second, everything moves. The herd goes from loafing to 20 miles per hour in a blink, and 3.4 million pounds of beef suddenly require steering because the alternative is a blacked-out video titled Hooves Over Everything. You and everyone with a horse under them light out at the edges, pushing the running front into a curve until the circle starts to close. It's the cattleman's equivalent of taking a tanker truck, drifting and convincing it to spin in a parking lot instead of plowing through town. Your shoulders shake from adrenaline for an hour after, and your horse breathes like a steam engine. The number of cowboys who die in gunfights on the trail is microscopic. The number who die in stampedes, drownings, or horses tripping at speed is depressingly non-zero. Trail accounts and historians like Walter Prescott Webb underscore it. The Great Plains does not hand out golden death scenes. It mostly hands out bad footing, bad weather, and wrong turns at the wrong time. River crossings eat time and occasionally people. The Red River is your first big test going north. Then the Canadian, the Cimarron, the Arkansas, depending on which trail you ride. Sandbars do not publish maps. The current throws entire conversations at your knees, and your best swimmers take point as the rest of the herd surges after. You might tie a lead steer to pull the uncertain ones around a bend in the channel. You might find a ford that worked last week and kills a horse today. Quicksand is not imaginary villain stuff out of comic books. You feel the ground go from firm to sucking, and you throw your weight the other way as the horse lunges. You see a steer vanish like a bad magic trick and pop up angry 10 feet downstream. Every crossing invents its own problem set. According to the National Park Service interpretive material on the Great Western and Chisholm Trails, the planning for a single crossing could eat a day, while you scout, test, and argue with the river's personality. Your wardrobe counts as technology, whether or not a boutique wants to admit it. Levi's riveted denim shows up in 1873 and spreads because buttons ripping off your trousers at a dead run while wrestling a steer is not a vibe. Before and after that sales pitch, you wear heavy ducking or wool pants, maybe suspenders, a cotton shirt, and a jacket that turns rain in theory into dampness in practice. The slicker lashed to your saddle, oiled canvas, called a fish, or a sou'wester slicker, keeps the worst off your back when a blue norther smacks the plains and puts the temperature in free fall in a few hours. You learn real quick why cowboy boots have high underslung heels. They hold your foot in the stirrup when a steer is trying to drag your horse sideways and you need your right leg to act like a fence post. Spurs use soft touches most of the time. The point is not to kick holes in your horse. It's to remind a half-wild animal that you both want to live. Your firearm rides on the saddle, not on your hip like a poster. A Colt single-action army, maybe, by 1873, or an older percussion revolver upgraded with metallic cartridges. A Winchester 1873 rifle shows up in a lot of crews later. You don't stand around doing quick draw practice because nobody's paying you to ventilate your own leg. Towns on the rail lines, including Dodge City and Abilene, carry ordinances so strict a modern security guard would blush. Dodge City requires guns to be checked with the sheriff by the late 1870s. The famous gunfighters make noise, but you meet more buffalo bones than bullets. What kills cowboys in numbers are horses that slam into prairie dog holes and throw you like a circus act without the applause, and rivers that haven't got time for your brand of confidence. The food on the trail earns its own place on the list of disappointments. Beef stands all around you, like a buffet you're not allowed to touch, because the owner is counting noses, and every missing steer is a missing dollar. You eat the profits only when one breaks a leg or turns up dead. Otherwise it's salt pork, beans, coffee thick enough to pave a road, sourdough, and the occasional onion or dried apple acquired in the last settlement. Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee dominates the chuck boxes by the 1870s, sold roasted but not ground, with a peppermint stick or coupon premium inside. The cook hands out candy like a benevolent tyrant to whoever grinds the beans without complaining. That same cook runs the camp like a low-key monarch. No cussing in the food line, no manhandling the biscuits, no using the coffee water to wash your socks. Good night organized chuck wagon protocol for a reason, and every working outfit copies it because broken routines kill. Hygiene looks like a comedy sketch written by a sadist. You bathe when a river plus free time, plus warm weather, accidentally line up like planets. You wash your socks when they turn into shovels. Your shirt gets cleaner when the wind blows hard enough to peel the surface off. Lice are not a villain from the past, produced by a smear campaign. Lice love you. Chiggers too. Your hair picks up dust so fine it lathers without soap. Thorns constantly audition for spots in your shins. Your bedroll, called a Shuganin cowboy slang, smells like wool, smoke, and last week's rain. You do not own deodorant. You do not miss deodorant because nobody around you remembers what normal smells like. Your relationship to time warps. The outfit moves 5 days straight and lies quiet for one if grass and water demand it. The cow boss controls the clock and the route like a human GPS that occasionally shrugs and says the river moved. The herd spreads out while grazing, compresses when pushed, and snarls at you if you rush them too fast. You learn to look at the sky and see not just weather, but grammar. High clouds like pulled wool mean wind. A hard blue dome all day can mean frost by sunrise. If the wind shifts, lightning out of a clean sky hits the tallest thing in sight, which is often you. Old hands tell you to keep iron away from your hat when the air goes metallic and your hair hums. You do not forget the feeling of your horse withers buzzing like a wire, and you do not need a peer-reviewed article to confirm that lightning shows up uninvited. Still, for the record, the university press book sprinkled through the Texas State Historical Association catalogs contain plenty of weather pages because the sky's not optional out here. You get paid at the end because no one trusts anyone until the beef stands behind a stockyard fence. Cattle trails became big business faster than cowboy songs could catch up. From 1867 to 1871, Abilene alone sees hundreds of thousands of head shoved onto trains. One banner year, 1871, pushes north, somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 cattle on the Chisholm, according to tallies preserved by Kansas agencies and historians who read cattle receipts. Like scripture, the money is real. So is the tick-borne disease that earns the catchy name, Texas fever. Midwestern farmers watch their native cattle drop dead after contact with herds from Texas brought in, carrying rhipicephalus ticks and the parasite Babesia. That's not an opinion. That's veterinary science. And the reason Kansas counties and then the state draw quarantine lines again and again, starting in 1867 and tightening in 1885. Joseph McCoy solves the first big blockade with a simple trick. Build the yards west of the quarantine line. Ship north, skirt the politics. By the mid-1880s, the lines bite back harder. Drives shove farther west, into the Panhandle, into no man's land in the Oklahoma Panhandle, up the Great Western Cattle Trail to Dodge City, to Ogallala, to Cheyenne. The game adapts until the fences and railroads kill the premise. You feel big in the saddle, and you feel small in the world. The plains used to hold buffalo herds, so dense travelers said the ground moved. By the early 1870s, professional hunters carry Sharps rifles and knock those herds flat at railroad speed. The piles of bones you ride past go to fertilizer factories. The bones of animals that set the rhythm of the plains for centuries turn into crops, somewhere back east, and you follow a new rhythm built on steam and telegraphs. The forts you see, Fort Sill, Fort Hays, Fort Dodge, exist because the United States insisted on remaking the map. Cattle follow empire and make it fat. You are a laborer in a machine that prints money and arguments. This job sucks in a way that gets inside your teeth, and it also builds a culture that outlasts its business case. The songs matter because they work, and because they say something you can hum when a steer tries to crush your knee. The slang matters because it's faster than formal English when a thunderhead pops at dusk. The table rules at the chuckwagon matter because without them, 10 hungry men turn into an argument with spoons. Andy Adams, a cowboy who got so tired of dime novels he wrote, the log of a cowboy in 1903, to counter the nonsense, describes the work with a mix of boredom and awe. His stuff reads like a man who lived it, because he did, and it lands closer to the truth than most Hollywood budgets. Boredom drains you as surely as saddle hours. Days go by with nothing more dramatic than a cow crossing a creek the wrong way. The worst nerve killer isn't the stampede. It's the constant waiting for a stamped letter to arrive in your brain that might say surprise. Here comes lightning. You repair tack, whittle bits of wood, run your thumb down the edge of your knife to see if it still shaves hair, and count the cattle so many times you recite here, notches in your sleep. The point men squint toward the horizon, looking for a line of dust that might be another herd, or just the wind. The swing riders nudge off a dozen steers dozen times and return to their day job swallowing grit. The drag riders turn their bandanas into tar filters. The wrangler curses the way horses decide to scatter precisely when a river appears. Despite the myth, you rarely pull your gun for anything but a snake, a signal, or a mercy shot. The words get more Spanish the closer you listen. Remuda, Rodia, Riata. Because you live inside a mexisphere of ranch work that predates the American flag. The chaps catching brush are a direct import from Mexico. You cut steer out of a herd the way vaqueros cut cattle a century earlier. The way you dally a rope around the horn. One loop, two, or a full turn. Sits in your muscle memory because a slip or a solid catch means the difference between a clean heel and a jerked shoulder. That rope usually starts as rawhide, stiff and stretching just enough to warn you before it snaps. The saddle horn takes abuse all day. The leather grows a history of dings and scuffs that could be mapped, and a good horn saves your life almost as often as the horse under it. You can measure your body breaking down by the calendar. Fingernails go black and do not apologize. Sunburn hits you on day 1 and again on day 2 under a different name. Your hands harden in self-defense. The inside of your knees grows calluses your city friends would declare mythical. Your back murmurs about betrayal every time you swing down to jerk a cinch or pull a rock out of a hoof. A slice of wire thrown by a broken fence cleaves your jeans and happens to stop just before it opens a new zipper down your thigh. You remember that Joseph Glidden patented barbed wire in 1874 because you meet it in brush where no fences stood 3 years ago. You also meet fence-cutting wars in Texas in 1883-1884 when some big ranchers fence water and others slice wire at night to open the range. Civilization does not arrive in a top hat and promise to be reasonable. The irony stacks high. You are surrounded by beef and eat pork. You live under the biggest sky imaginable and spend half your attention on the ground in front of your horse front feet. You endure heat that melts thought and cold that chisels your bones and choose this job because the alternatives are tenant farming, sharecropping, factory lungs, or staying home and watching your life turn into someone else's plan. The cattle drive gives you a season-sized paycheck in a lump and the illusion of freedom that still sort of smells like freedom when you hit Dodge City, to be generous. The first step on Front Street passes posters for wet bars and hotter cards than a Bible study. Your wages meet a roulette wheel in a second-floor office, and the house wins. A cowhand's spree in a rail town often ends with a penniless ride back south and a head full of bad whiskey. Dodge actually tried to slow this parade by confiscating guns and passing curfews because capitalism likes paying customers alive. Abilene flames out as a cattle town in a few years because the quarantine lines and the rails move. Newton, Ellsworth, Wichita, Caldwell, and then Dodge City each take a turn as the end of the trail. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe hits Dodge in 1872, and the stockyards erupt with more hats than a county fair. Ogallala, Nebraska, sees your dust by the late 1870s. Cheyenne turns into a cattle baron social club, as much as a cow town, with ranges to the north and capital to the east. The year 1884 looks fat. Then a double punch arrives. Winter 1886-87. The big die-up sears itself into the mythology and the bank accounts. Deep snow, brutal wind, and a hard freeze that breaks in a thaw that coats everything in ice. Cattle drift hundreds of miles and stack up in arroyos and fences, dying by stupids and by blizzard. Contemporary reports count losses on unfenced ranges at 50 to 75% in some districts. Howard R. Lamar and other Western historians pile the scholarship. The number of rotting carcasses by spring makes ranchers faint and banks file new math. Even before that winter, the business is changing. Railroads punch deeper into Texas. The Missouri, Kansas, Texas. The Hypatia hits Denison in 1872. The San Antonio and Aransas Pass starts lacing South Texas by the mid-1880s. Barbed wire cords up the open range. Quarantine laws stiffen against Texas fever. Cattle companies fund giant fenced spreads in Wyoming and Montana. The teenage long drive shrinks into local pushes to closer depots, and eventually trucks and feedlots swallow the work. The open trail becomes a museum diorama with excellent lighting and a gift shop stocking Stetsons. And you become folklore in the same way a steam engine turns into a calendar photo. The culture, the songs, the bravado, the boots, the myth live on. But the business model, shove beeves 1,000 miles to hit a railroad town that did not exist 5 years ago, cannot survive modernization and a winter that decides to be a final boss. The reality check keeps coming. You rarely own the cattle you drive. You own a saddle, a bedroll, and a handful of shirts you can squeeze into a biscuit tin when dry. The trail boss carries the contract with the northern buyer. Your stake is sweat. If you put in a couple of seasons and avoid a broken spine, you might move up to wagon boss or day boss. You might save enough to buy 10 or 20 head and start your own brand if the land situation loosens. A handful of hands make it big. Most move on when their knees and anger points say enough. The parts of the job that look glamorous from a distance shine for a reason, even as they cut. Sunsets on the Llano Estacado do not get old because they take up the entire world. Horses trained into willing dance partners for roping and sorting feel like magic under a good hand. A herd strung out under a sky of ink with stars salted so thick you mistake the Milky Way for a river is almost religious. Those moments pull stories out of you decades later. They also mislead. For every night like that, you get a morning where thunderheads move in 2 directions at once, and you consider learning to swim in chaps. Source trails run through everything you touch. Goodnight's memoir fragments and Charles Goodnight's own chuckwagon innovation set rules that live for a century. Abilene's city records and McCoy's marketing genius shape who buys beefware. The Smithsonian and the National Cowboy Museum keep photographs of crews with names and dates. 1878. Dodge Bound, or 1883. Trail north of the red. So you can stop arguing about whether any black cowboys existed and look at the glass plates. The Kansas State Historical Society holds receipts in newspapers that sound like business pages, shouting about record runs, and yet another quarantine line moved to block another wave of Texas fever. The Texas State Historical Association publishes biographies and route maps that finally nail down where the Goodnight Loving went after Loving died in 1867 of infection after a Comanche fight near the Pecos. The National Park Service stands with road signs near the old trails and announces, "This is where you forded and nearly died, and then pretended it was fun in a saloon later." You rarely sleep indoors during a drive. The bunkhouse, another Hollywood favorite, belongs back at the ranch. On the trail, you roll out your bed in a ring near the chuck and the remuda and hope the guy on Nighthawk duty walks a big enough circle. You place your boots under the edge of your bedroll so scorpions find a hobby elsewhere. You keep your saddle as a pillow because Western hotels are not sending you a decorative one. When it rains, the bedroll goes from sleeping bag to sponge, and you layer your slicker above it and pray. When it hails, you consider sleeping under the wagon and discover you are not the first to have that bright idea. The economics of energy today would salute your calorie burn like a drill sergeant. 10 to 15 hours in the saddle can chew through 4,000 to 5,000 calories, depending on weather and ground. Beans, bacon, and biscuits barely keep up. Your belt ends the season a notch tighter, your shoulders a rope thicker, and your patience shortened to a point. The diet has a weird upside. Scurvy stalks sailors trapped on ships for months. A cattle drive lasts weeks to a few months, and sometimes includes onions and potatoes at river towns, so your gums resent you but do not revolt as hard as they might. A flew off a passing wagon, though, knocks through a camp like a bowling ball. No antibiotics exist, no health plan beyond keep him warm and hope. The legal landscape plays referee sometimes just to remind you that civilization is not asleep. Cattle rustling laws in Texas and Kansas tighten. Brand inspectors count notches and irons before a buyer writes a check. A brand tells a story in a single hairless scar. Lazy J, Flying M, Circle Bar, and the inspector reads like a librarian. You learn to study cattle like faces. A notch in the right ear, a swallow fork in the left, a brand high on the hip. You memorize them, in case you end up in front of a judge, trying to explain why a steer went missing in the Cimarron, when you are sure it fell into a cut bank and someone else is sure you sold it to your cousin. Historians pull these details out of court ledgers because the paper trail snowballs by the late 1870s. The social hierarchy on the drive keeps order by need. The trail boss picks routes and sets policy. The cook enforces etiquette with a ladle and the threat of cold biscuits. The wrangler cares for the remuda and will hide your saddle if you insult his horses one time too many. The point riders often ride the best mounts because getting the front right steers the rest. Green hands go to drag because coming eyes to eyes with a million flies builds humility and trains you faster than advice. The pay differential shows you who the boss trusts and who is learning under hazard pay that looks suspiciously like regular pay. Positions shuffle when someone proves he can count cattle at dusk and recognize missing brands in the morning. Western memoirs line up behind this like they practiced. By the time the 1880s close, your trade shrinks into a legend. The hands who did it move on to ranches that now fence pastures and run windmills. A few head north into the Canadian ranching boom or Montana outfits that fence whole valleys and need riders to check herds through a winter that blows snow sideways for days. Rodeos, born out of work skills displayed for fun, turn into paying shows by the 1890s. Bill Pickett, born in 1870 and working into the early 20th century, invents steer wrestling the way. Showman invents stunts. By turning a work trick and a dog cowboy technique into a crowd pleaser, the American West exports a refined version of your job that fits stadiums. It fills seats. It sells soda. It bears little resemblance to you gulching a steer out of quicksand with a rawhide reator while cussing into a stiff north wind. You take pride because pride gets a man to the next river as much as food does. The craft of it matters. The way you ease pressure on the herd to stop them milling. The way you shape a curve on a stampede run before it hardens into unstoppable. The way you judge whether a calf can cross now or needs carrying. The way you pick a campsite that offers water, grass, and a clean approach for the herd to bed down. Those micro decisions keep you employed. They also keep everyone alive. A trail crew is a temporary company assembled to execute a dangerous logistical operation without a safety net. And the job title says, Cowboy, because brand consultant had not been invented yet. The misery list keeps adding. And still the job grows a halo in hindsight. Something about being very small in a very large world carves grooves in a person that stories like to run in. The land leaves lines on your face and in your memory that a city will never replicate. You hate and love the sound of cattle moving in the dark, in a way even you cannot untangle. You can laugh later at the time you fell asleep in the saddle and woke up leaning on the horn like it was a bedpost with your horse still holding the line. You treasure the day the cook produced pie out of nowhere because a rancher's wife handed him dried apples and a smile at Red River Station. Strip the romance for a minute, and your job takes its place on a chart of necessary labor. You help feed a nation that urbanizes in a hurry between 1870 and 1890. You haul protein to places where railroads feed slaughterhouses, feeding stockyards, feeding cities. The Chicago Board of Trade tracks numbers like a heartbeat, and you supply them. The smell of meat packing, the tannery reek, the harsh logic of live weight versus dressed beef all exist downstream of your dust. Without you pushing beeves north, refrigerated railcars find fewer loads. Entrepreneurs like Gustavus Swift make ice and rails work for carcasses in the late 1870s and 1880s, and your labor connects the live animal to the dressed beef empire. The West turns into an economic story as much as a pioneer one, and you're the guy who gets up at 3:30 a.m. to make it happen. This job in the heyday of the drives from 1866 to 1886 teaches you that structure keeps chaos polite. The herd moves each day at a speed cattle can chew, not at a speed a man can brag about. You water them when you can, shade them when cottonwoods appear, and you push when the ground says push. You build your day around the chuck wagon because calories steer attitude. You respect a good horse like it's a partner because it is. You hang your gun on the saddle where it does not chafe and pretend you might never need it. You learn to sleep in slices because nobody gets a full night. You accept the reality that a quarter of the men around you are black, a whole bunch are Mexican, and everyone is dirty in equal proportions. You realize that the icons plastered on beer ads a century later leave out the smell because corporate nostalgia cannot package ammonia. The bad moments keep receipts, lightning storms that take one horse out from under a hand and leave a singed line down his neck. A crossing where a steer tangles in a rope, drags a horse, and you knife the rope before the whole mess goes under. A stampede that ends with a pile of dead animals in a draw and silent riders counting the tally. A sick spell that sweeps 5 men into blankets at once while the rest shoulder their shifts double. The good moments have receipts too. A moonrise over the Cimarron, so fat and yellow it looks, buttered. A day with a tailwind and cool air when the herd moves like a choreographed river. A remuda that comes to the bell mare clean and easy for once. A market price in Dodge that means the crew gets its pay fast and thick, not thin and argumentative. The myth tells you the cowboy shoots first and asks questions when the whiskey wears off. The actual cowboy shoots snakes, wolves, and an occasional crazy cow, signals at distance with a rifle in the air, and harbors a horror of paperwork from municipal courts. The towns themselves, in their ordinances and newspaper scolds, try to keep drive season behavior less feral. Dodge City builds a reputation as lawless, while simultaneously employing a long roster of lawmen who post rules on Front Street. Abilene cycles through mayors and marshals who hand out fines because broken windows and shot civilians are bad for business. These places embrace the cattle money and try to manage the human fallout. The record in their archives reads like a slow-motion apology to the myth machine. As the century turns, nostalgia laces up its riding boots. Buffalo Bill Cody builds a show and tours the world with a curated West. Your trail work shows up in an arena in a sanitized, safer, choreographed form. Painters like Charles M. Russell and Frederick Remington turn your friends into bronzes and oils with light that drips like syrup. The real work keeps shrinking. Cattle still move, but fences and water tanks, later windmills and pumps, then trucks, finally finished the open-range job that began with a lariat on Spanish Mission land 2 centuries earlier. Journalists turned historians and cowboy memoirists preserve enough detail that anyone who cares can find it, and the rest of the world keeps the soundtracks and the boots and the movies. You learn a few rules the hard way, and they stick. Never put your bedroll where the water will run if a storm cuts loose at midnight. Never rope anything, unless you mean to tie it to something heavier than both of you. Never ride a green horse into deep water. Never overdrive cattle into a wind that keeps them from smelling the men behind them. Never insult the cook. Never underestimate a cloudless morning in Texas just because it started nice. Never pretend you can outshout a river. Never forget Joseph Glidden's fence will change your life. Never bet your whole season in one night in a town where a piano plays louder than the church bell. Never brag about not falling asleep in the saddle because the prairie will notice. Always coil your rope the same way. Always double-check your cinch. Always be suspicious of a steer with its head low and eyes set back because a hook will follow. Always make time to sing at night. It is not optional. It is equipment. By the textbook, the period of massive long drives is a blip. 20 years and change of concentrated madness. By lived experience, it's an era you carry until you can no longer lift a saddle. The history books in the Texas State Historical Association's library bracketed with dates, and the Kansas museums bracketed with stockyard tallies. The Smithsonian hosts photographs of sunburnt faces under dusty brims and tells you the work was diverse and difficult and very mortal. The National Park Service plots where the trails ran and offers plaques to travelers in air conditioning. Your body offers its own archives. Knees that pop every time the weather shifts. A scar across your thumb from a rear-to catch that went sideways. A ridge of callus where a rope burned a lesson into you. Those are not myths. Those are chapter headings you don't have to read aloud. Here is why it sucked. Compressed for anyone with a romantic poster on the wall. The hours ran long. The pay ran short. The weather ran everything. The food ran beige. And the only thing that ran faster than the cattle when spooked was your pulse. Stampedes could kill you in a heartbeat, and boredom could kill your brain cell by cell. Water could vanish when maps said it lived here. Last season, ticks carried parasites that changed laws and routes. Rivers punished arrogance. Horses punished gracelessness. Bosses withheld pay and saloons vacuumed it up. Town ordinances treated you like a liability even as merchants smiled at your wages. Barbed wire arrived like a new sheriff and reorganized a landscape in a decade. Winter shrugged and erased herds. Railroads wrote schedules that made you a delivery mechanism, lucky to be thanked. You worked, you heard, you adapted. The legend that came later swept a string of pearls across the grit and called it a necklace. You also lived inside. One of the most intensely skilled pieces of American work ever done without a blueprint. A dozen riders, a wagon, a wrangler, and a rolling nerve system of thousands of animals that think with their noses and their stomachs and their herd sense. You learned to be fluent in that. You built a culture tight enough to move as one under pressure. You kept a set of songs so lean and functional they still fit in the saddlebag of modern country music. You wore gear engineered by generations of horse people, soldiered through weather that treats humans like misprints, and came out on the far side in a rail town that could not decide whether to kiss you or fine you. This job sucked in the way that mountain climbing sucks, and coal mining sucks, and deep-sea fishing in winter sucks. By taking your measure and charging interest, the accounts that survive, from Andy Adams to Joseph McCoy to the piles at the Kansas State Historical Society and the Texas State Historical Association, still carry the dust. The photos at the Smithsonian still carry the squint. The routes on National Park Service maps still trace the skeleton of a story so famous it got mistaken for a fairy tale. You, in the saddle then, would laugh at the greeting card version, and then quietly fix your cinch and roll out. The work does not care whether anyone in a century believes in it. The work only cares whether you can keep the herd from running tonight. So you ride, and you count, and you choke down beans, and you sing to 1,000 sleeping animals, because they calm down when the dark talks. And at dawn, with your eyes gummy in your mouth, tasting like a leather shop, you swing up again. The trail stretches north like a sentence, without a period. The land breathes around you. The money hovers ahead, like a rumor. The myth lives out past the horizon, waiting for a painter. You live here, now, under a brim, over a horse, in a job that stinks and sears, and still occasionally feels like standing on the front step of the world. That is why it sucked to be a cowboy on a cattle drive. That is also why the story refused to die. Next, let's turn our attention to the achievements of Hypatia, pioneering female scholar. A mob in Alexandria, in March 415, tore a mathematician to pieces with broken tiles. Not a witch, not a revolutionary general, an academic in a philosopher's cloak riding home in a chariot. A lector named Peter led the attack. The body was dragged to the Caesareum, flayed with pottery shards. Ostraka, the same stuff students used as scratch paper, and the remains burned at a place called Cineron. The city's bishop, Cyril, and the imperial prefect, Orestes, were locked in a feud that made modern office politics look like a potluck, and rumors swirled that a certain philosopher stood between them. That philosopher was Hypatia of Alexandria. Newspapers did not exist in 415, but the crowd still fed on headlines. She advised the governor. She was too famous, too learned, too visible, in a city that loved brilliance, right up to the moment it didn't. Fame could turn fatal in a week. This is the story people remember, and it is harrowing. But it only lands with that much force because of everything that came before it. What made a 4th century crowd go after a scholar is also what made Hypatia a legend. For 1,600 years, she built instruments that modeled the cosmos. She kept centuries of mathematics alive with clear, usable commentaries. She taught the sons of governors and bishops, and she did it all in public, while wearing the philosopher's tribon like an amplifier. She was not a symbol. She was, infuriatingly for her enemies, very real and very effective. Roll back the clock to the Alexandria she grew up in. Population in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps 300,000 by conservative estimates. A port where ships from Rhodes and Rome unloaded grain, papyrus, and hot gossip. The lighthouse of Pharos, still counted as a world wonder. The Serapeum's great library had been smashed in, 391 under imperial orders, and the direction of Bishop Theophilus, Cyril's uncle, which means this eternal misunderstanding can be retired with prejudice. Hypatia did not run the great library, and she did not die inside it. That building was already rubble and sermon material by the time she hit her stride. The Mausian, the old scholarly complex that had sheltered mathematicians like Eratosthenes and astronomers like Eratosthenes, long before, was a memory with a half-life. Alexandria still thought with rigor, but the city had learned to do it in private houses, lecture halls tucked behind courtyards, and the kind of classrooms where chalk dust was replaced by papyrus shavings. Her father, Theon of Alexandria, wrote commentaries on Ptolemy's, Almagest and on Euclid. He fancied himself of the Mausian, a label that says more about branding than payroll at that point. Theon was a meticulous editor and teacher who lived by a simple equation: survive in a collapsing academic ecosystem through clarity. He trained his daughter inside that equation. Greek geometry and astronomy were household chores in the Theon place. One preface in his commentary on the Almagest, Book 3, does the ancient equivalent of tagging her on Instagram. Theon says the edition was revised by the philosopher Hypatia, my daughter. Those are not empty words. Textual evidence shows that her hand was in the version of Ptolemy people would read for generations. In other words, the star map Europe used, in some form, bore her fingerprints. She did not stop with Ptolemy. A 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia, the Suda, the Wikipedia of the Eastern Roman Empire, but with fewer anonymous editors and more monks, lists her works, commentaries on Diophantus's Arithmetica, on Apollonius's Conics, and on the astronomical canon. Commentaries sound like footnotes to the uninitiated. In late antiquity they were lifelines. A clean commentary saved a difficult text for another 1,000 years. A muddled one buried it. Diophantus wrote problems about rational solutions to equations that today get slapped with the label algebra, even though his style was rhetorical and pre-symbolic. 13 books existed in antiquity. 6 survive in Greek today, with 4 more preserved in Arabic discovered in the 20th century. Hypatia's commentary did not survive, but secondary references point to her labor of explanation, where mathematicians actually live. In the examples, in the intricacies, in how lines become levers. As for Apollonius, his conics in 8 books mapped circles, ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas with a precision that modern engineering still uses. 4 books survive in Greek, 3 more in Arabic. Hypatia's commentary stood between those curves and oblivion during a time when scribes dropped off due to plagues, budgets, and bad coffee. The Suda's list is not clickbait. It is the scaffolding that kept the ancient math edifice up long enough to be seen. Translated into Arabic in the 9th and 10th centuries, and passed back into Latin in the 12th and 13th. She did not live in a library. She ran a classroom that felt like a civic theatre. Socrates Scholasticus, a 5th century church historian with the excellent habit of being proportional, describes her as surpassing all philosophers of her time, wearing the philosopher's mantle and moving around the city publicly, interpreting Plato and Aristotle. He adds something both precise and eyebrow-raising. She was not embarrassed to appear before magistrates because her self-possession removed the disadvantage of being a woman in that environment. It reads like a compliment from 440 and a subtweet in 2026. That sentence is also data. She did not whisper. She spoke to packed rooms and to power. The way she did mathematics proves the point. Synesius of Cyrene, one of her students, left at least 10 letters addressed to her that still exist. He later became Bishop of Ptolemais in the Libyan Pentapolis around 410 and died around 413 or 414, which makes those letters contemporaneous diaries by a Christian who adored his pagan teacher. He calls her mother, sister, teacher, benefactor, and not just in the metaphorical sense of spiritual fluffiness. He begs for build advice. He literally orders hardware. One letter asks her to send a hydroscope. Another tells a friend about an astrolabe he assembled, attributing the design and instruction to his teacher in Alexandria. Whether one pronounces astrolabe with that long R or short, it is one of the coolest objects ancient science ever invented. A handheld model of the sky. Plate-stacked bronze with a rotating star map on top. A reed shaped like a spiderweb of constellations. And an alidide as a sight. A planisphere that calculates in one gesture what the dome of the heavens is doing. Times of sunrise, positions of planets if you add the right plates, the height of a star above the horizon, the time of night when the stars had nothing better to do than be stars. Hipparchus and Ptolemy had the concept. Instruments existed earlier. Hypatia taught the thing, built the thing, and shipped versions to alumni like some schools ship sweatshirts. Senjusiu's treatise on the gift of an astrolabe is an unintentional advertisement for her lab. He says he learned the device's secrets from a woman wiser than he, his revered teacher. He writes like a man who has touched a piece of the cosmos with his hands and cannot go back to sundials. He describes components, discs for different latitudes, a rete with star pointers, a rule for measures, the ability to simulate the moving sky on a bronze sandwich less than a handspan across. Those details map onto an actual instrument built in a classroom with actual tools. No raw magic, no hand-waving, just craft. She also equipped Synesius with something more humble, the hydroscope. Imagine a glass tube with calibrated markings and a weight, used to measure the specific gravity of liquids. Synesius asks for one, because in Ptolemy's, quality control mattered, and he wanted to measure density like a pro. That instrument's presence in the letters undercuts a fantasy about Hypatia as purely speculative. She could go from Plato to the viscosity of olive oil in a lecture series. The mix of high theory and hard edges characterized her teaching. She followed a late antique Neoplatonism that treated mathematics as the bridge between the body and the intelligible. No need to conjure spirits. The numbers themselves led the mind upward. Synesius detested the ritual-heavy trend inside some Neoplatonic circles. His letters to her read like a conservative Christian, pleading for a strictly intellectual route to the divine. She was his proof that it existed. He sent her drafts of his own works, on dreams among them, and asked for critique. He told her when he took ill, when his children died, when he was forced into a bishop's seat he did not entirely want. She anchored his life with theory and practical goods, and he gave her network effects. A former student inside the church, writing as an ally. The traffic ran both ways. The curriculum she ran is not a guess. The subjects she's attached to are not random. Students in Alexandria learned Euclidean geometry as a language. They learned arithmetic using Diophantine techniques that were not plug and chug but cleverness training. They learned conic sections because astronomy needed them to explain apparent planetary motion on deference and epicycles. Yes, those circles on circles that nailed predictions long before elliptical orbits showed up on the math sat. From that geometry to Ptolemy's Almagest, the Syntaxis Mathematica in 13 books, with tables for planetary motions and a lunar theory of chilling precision. The pipeline was standard. What wasn't standard was a woman leading the department. Damasus, the last head of the Athenian school of philosophy, wrote later about her. His Life of Isidore tells stories with a taste for drama. He calls her remarkable in speech and action, of a noble and godlike soul. He states she remains celibate, and he includes an anecdote so fable-like that modern readers blink. Faced with an importunate suitor, she allegedly held up the cloth she used during menstruation to point out the realities of the flesh, and the suitor lost his appetite for romance. That story reeks of rhetorical instruction. Damasus is not live tweeting the 4th century. He is performing it. Yet the anecdote nails something verifiable. She defended her life choices with the same unfussy realism she brought to constructing a hydroscope. She did not drape her decisions in mystique. She just made them. This concrete directness made her formidable in public. Socrates Scholasticus does not count her brilliance as mere intellectual fire. He notes her influence over city officials. That line is the fuse that burned down to her murder. Alexandria's political situation, after 391, would shame a soap opera. The great temple of Serapis fell. The pagan civic institutions lost their scaffolding, and a newer Christian power base coalesced around bishops who held not just pulpits but patronage. Cyril became bishop in 412 after his uncle Theophilus. He was tough, organized, and determined to make the church the city's spine. Orestes, the imperial prefect, represented imperial authority. He held legal power, soldiers, and the Roman bureaucracy's taste for stamping forms and finishing enemies. They were never going to have branch. Alexandria's Christians included the Parabolani, a fraternity of hospital workers and bodyguards with a habit of being where the trouble was. There were also Nitrian monks who came into town like a rugby squad with claim tickets for holiness and muscle. A flare-up got explosive in 415. A Christian named Hyrax was accused of agitating at the theatre. The Jewish community, long a major presence in Alexandria since Ptolemaic times, got into the mix. Cyril reacted by expelling Jews en masse and taking over their synagogues. Orestes objected. A monk named Ammonius assaulted Orestes and nearly opened his head on the street. Imperial soldiers executed Ammonius. Cyril hailed him as a martyr. The prefect called that out as nonsense. Socrates Scholasticus documents this sequence in cold prose. He paints a city on a knife edge. Enter Hypatia. She did not lead the prefect's cavalry or draft imperial edicts, but she had the one thing both men needed: credibility. The crowd believed she advised Orestes. Rumors formed like thunderheads. John of Nikiu, a 7th century Coptic bishop, writing in a chronicle, describes her as an accursed pagan who bewitched the prefect and blocked reconciliation. His words read like fever. He writes much later, with sanctimony rather than evidence, but his take shows the story that floated among zealots: the philosopher as enchantress, the smart woman as obstacle. She absolutely was a pagan philosopher. She absolutely was respected by the prefect. She did not incant spells. She did something more dangerous. She counseled moderation in a conflict that fed on absolutism. The murder landed with the precision of premeditation. Peter the Lector assembled a crowd during Lent. Socrates Scholasticus stresses the date, a season of supposed humility and repentance. Hypatia's chariot was stopped. She was pulled from it, dragged to the Caesareum, once a temple, then a church, and killed with shards. The use of ostraca made for a neat bit of dark symbolism. The tools of democratic exile in classical Athens, the cheap writing surfaces of this city's schools, now weapons. She died in her late 40s to early 60s, depending on which birth year one uses. Estimates range from c. 355 to c. 370. The crowd dismembered and burned her body. The prefect did not retaliate with spectacular justice. He may have feared civil war. He may have been calculating. He may have been too late. Cyril was not legally tried. Politics moved on. The city recorded one more entry in its ledger of brilliance and blood. The temptation to pack that last sequence into the morality play of science versus religion is strong. It is also sloppy. The real script is realer and messier. Hypatia had Christian students. Synesius, bishop and scholar, revered her. The violence came from a power struggle between two Christian factions, bishop and prefect, who fought for the city's soul after the pagan civic core fell. Hypatia fell because she was central and respected, not because she stood on a pagan lectern giving heliocentric TED Talks that nobody asked for. She did not propose heliocentrism. She did not invent the astrolabe out of thin air. She did not direct the Great Library. She was not burned alive in a library fire while holding a scroll of trigonometry like a martyrdom painting. She was a working scholar who taught, wrote, built, edited, and advised with enough charisma to appear dangerous to men who lived on control. The instruments tell the story best. The planispheric astrolabe she and her students used required real measurements and real math. A star catalogue with positions in degrees. An understanding of latitude. An ability to project the sphere on a flat surface using stereographic projection. A reed cut to align with known stars like Sirius, Arcturus, Aldebaran. A set of plates for different latitudes. Alexandria sits at roughly 31 degrees north, so that the ecliptic and horizon lines line up for different cities. There were rules engraved along the rim. A degree scale of 360, sometimes with subdivisions. Calendrical scales, so that one could find where the sun sat on a given day by aligning the date to the zodiac. With that, a student could time prayers, predict rising times, calculate if Venus would be visible before dawn, and pose as a wizard to people who preferred drama to dynamics. Every part of that device says pedagogy. It collapses the sky for the hand and lets a human imagine being a mind wrapped around stars. Her editing hand on Ptolemy mattered as much to that pedagogy. The Almagest is not cuddly. 13 books of geometry, trigonometry, and planetary models add up to a monument of applied thought. Ptolemy's table of chords, basically a trig table before sines and cosines, took over the conversation. Let's one compute angles. He used a lunar period of 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 3 seconds, 29.53059 days, which is hair-raisingly accurate, even by modern standards. He used an obliquity of the ecliptic around 23 degrees 51 minutes. These numbers are not vibes. They are artisanal precision. Theon's addition, with Hypatia's help, is the one that most medieval readers encountered. When Arabic astronomers like al-Battani, 858-929, and later Latin scholars worked from Ptolemy, they did not encounter fresh from the Furge manuscripts that leaped out of the 2nd century with no wear. They got hand-copied versions traced through Alexandria's school. Hypatia stood in that chain, giving readers cleaner steps from lemma to theorem. Her commentary on Apollonius's conics kept more than math alive. Comic sections were the secret engine behind everything from Parthenon optics to, centuries later, Kepler's laws of planetary motion. Apollonius did the heavy lifting around 200 BC. He introduced the terms ellipse, parabola, and hyperbola. That library of curves sat on shelves, while astronomers used circles and epicycles to keep planets on schedule. The marriage of conics to orbits came a millennium and a half after Apollonius wrote. Hypatia's commentaries made learning Apollonius something a student could do without dying of pure despair at the Greek. A clear commentary is time travel for ideas. By explaining how the definitions work, by showing how a focus and directrix play out, by clarifying lemmas where Apollonius assumed an audience of exactly 2 equally brilliant friends. She ensured that when the Islamicate world translated Greek texts into Arabic in the 9th century, they had a text that teachers could actually teach. Alhazen's optics, Al-Khwarizmi's algebra, and the entire translation movement in Baghdad's Beit al-Hikmah did not happen in isolation. They fed on Greek sources preserved by scribes and teachers who kept copying and explaining. Hypatia is in that supply chain. The hydroscope, humble though it seems, shows how she pulled traction from theory. Measuring specific gravity is not glamorous, but it adjusts the density of knowledge to the needs at hand. A glass tube, weighted, marked with scale increments that correspond to density, allowed an operator to test wine, oil, or other liquids. Cineas's request to Hypatia to send one tells a simple story. A bishop in Libya needed a precision tool. The best workshop for such things was in a philosopher's classroom in Alexandria. Shipping and handling applied. That one letter pops the balloon of a shamanic myth and replaces it with a supply chain. Her gender magnified the astonishment of contemporaries and later observers. Hypatia was not the first woman to philosophize. Anyone who remembers Arete of Cyrene, head of a school in the 4th century B, knows that. But she was the best documented female mathematician of antiquity, the one who stepped into public and taught men, who then wrote about it. Contemporary accounts do not fixate on her looks the way later Victorian retellings do. Socrates Scholasticus mentions her modesty and self-possession, not measurements. Damascius admires her eloquence and dignified bearing. Synesius's letters are full of respect, so palpable that modern readers lean back from them, like heat, when later polemicists tried to sexualize or demonize her. They did so because the file had to be rewritten for simpler ideologies. She did not tremble inside a romantic painting. She wore the philosopher's cloak and walked into rooms where bureaucrats sweated, and she told them what mattered. That is gender politics with more sharp edges than hashtags. The city's ecosystem made that audacity necessary. Alexandria at the turn of the 5th century was, despite legend, a bit of a STEM and spreadsheets town. Astronomers kept time for sailors and liturgical calendars. Architects calculated load and leverage for public works. Administrators calculated grain shipment. Rome devoured Egyptian grain the way modern cities devour server space. The census needed math. Teachers who could connect Platonic forms to practical forms got paid. Hypatia stood at that intersection with grace and ferocity. She could explain Aristotle's categories before noon and tweak an instrument's scale after lunch. She also knew prey before prey knew itself. Wearing the tribon was an act of branding. Philosophers in antiquity wore the thin, rough cloak that signaled austerity. A uniform as recognizable on the streets of Alexandria as a lab coat at a conference. She used it to take a place that the city had not pre-assigned to her. Socrates Scholasticus records that she appeared before magistrates openly. That visibility served her students. It turned philosophy into something the powerful might actually consume without choking on jargon. The cloud of respect around her, students, city officials, merchants, made her school a civic good, and it made her enemies decide that snapping that web would cripple a rival center of influence. They were not wrong. The myth-busting list is long, so the key points land like drumbeats. She was not the director of the Great Library. The Serapeum's collection was destroyed in 391. Her career flourished in the 390s and 410. She did not die in a burning library. Her death happened at the Caesareum. Her body was burned at Cineron afterward. Source: Socrates Scholasticus, Ecclesiastical History, 7.15. She did not invent the astrolabe. Instruments and treatises predate her by centuries. She taught, refined, and constructed them. Her student Syngesius documented both learning and building, one under her guidance in On the Gift of an Astrolabe, and in letters. She did not propose heliocentric astronomy. That honor in Greek antiquity belongs to Aristarchus of Samos in the 3rd century Bars. Hypatia taught Ptolemaic astronomy with circles and epicycles. She was not executed as a pure martyr for science. Her murder was political violence inside a Christian city during a power struggle between Bishop Cyril and Prefect Orestes. Her visibility and influence were the trigger. Sources: Socrates, Scholasticus. Later, John of Mycenae for the hostile spin. She did not invent algebra, nor did she write symbolic equations with X and Y. She commented on Diophantus's Arithmetica, a rhetorical algebra that trained minds in number puzzles without modern notation. She did not become the last pagan high priestess of a temple cult. She was a secular philosopher, living a civic intellectual life, with friends across religious lines. Now pivot back from the busting to the building. Her father's editorial work on Euclid's Elements assembled an edition that outlived empires. Theon's stated aim was to make the text easier for learners. He standardized definitions and proofs. That edition became the basis for most medieval copies. Students learned Euclid from his smoother pages, and thereby learned geometry at all. Hypatia grew up inside that revision culture. Her own commentaries on Diophantus and Apollonius almost certainly pursued the same aim: walk the student through the logic without condescension. Put the lemma in the mouth of someone who is not performing a rhetorical thunderstorm, even if those working proofs and examples are lost. Later references to her work suggest exactly that. The Suda is maddeningly blunt. It lists titles without content, but the inertia of teacherly habits tells the rest. A classroom catalogue came with something else. Community. Names survive. Synesius of Cyrene. Herculean, possibly a student versed in grammar. Olympius, Theodosius. The exact enrollments do not come with a registrar's app, but one letter from Synesius lists a small network who studied with her and kept in touch, the late antique version of a cohort. Another letter to a friend mentions a book trunk she arranged to ship. Freighted thought. The numbers of letters matter because they show more than deference. They show logistics. A bishop who writes 156 letters total in the surviving corpus, 10 or more to one teacher, is not just genuflecting. He is doing life with guidance. She also knew how to show up. Socrates' remark that she did not blanch in assemblies of men because her self-possession removed the disadvantage of her sex sounds like a throwaway to modern ears. It is not. Public speech in Alexandria had rules. Philosophers argued. Orators performed. Women of high status moved in elite circles, but the public lecture by a woman addressing a mixed audience of students and officials was rare. Hypatia did it again and again. She gave moral counsel, the ancient version of a TED Talk without microphones, inside a system that prized logos as civic glue. She helped the city remain a city. There is a detail that hums with modern resonance. Synesius begged her to keep teaching mathematics in Alexandria, even as politics worsened. He did not simply pump her ego. He argued that the city would go blind without that light. This is not a slogan. It is government policy argued through letters. Math and philosophy as city services sounds grandiose. In Alexandria, it was infrastructure. Astronomy timed the life of both temple and church. Arithmetic ran taxes. Geometry built ships. A woman in charge of a math school was not a quirky flourish. She was a keystone. Her death did not, of course, kill math. Alexandria limped on. Cyril emerged more powerful and eventually earned a sainthood with a theological resume that looms large in Christian history. His role in the Council of Ephesus in 431 against Nestorius would have made headlines for months. If there had been printing presses, Orestes vanishes from the record like a manager, transferred to a provincial post nobody visits. The Parabalani were later placed under stricter regulation. The city kept tracking stars, but the horror of her killing burned a shape in memory. Philosophers in late antiquity and the early medieval period remembered a specific life that ended under specific hands. Damascius wrote with regret about the world that was ending. Each retelling added patina. Enlightenment writers in the 18th century made her into a blank slate for anti-clerical polemics. Romantic painters turned her into tragic beauty. Carl Sagan's 1980 Cosmos episode filmed her as the last librarian of the Library of Alexandria, a powerful sequence with cinematic smoke but anachronistic sourcing. The film Agora, 2009, does admirable work, making the late Roman world feel lived in, but bends chronology and invention because films need arcs. Meanwhile, the letters, the Suda, Socrates, and Damascius sat there like calm librarians, reminding anyone who reads them that the real story does not need extra violins. Her achievements are bigger than the list of commentaries. She professionalized brilliance. There's a case to be made that she helped fix the default image of a mathematician as a public adult, not cloistered weirdness. 5th century students watched a woman advise officials, guide episcopal candidates, build an astrolabe, propose proofs, and hold a school day together. The next time a 9th century translator in Baghdad wrestled with a Greek text, the roads built by teachers like her kept the traffic moving. Algebra traveled. Geometry traveled. Astronomical tables traveled. Her father's edition of Euclid became standard. Her edition of Ptolemy shaped the copy stream. When Chaucer's students in the 14th century saw a treatise on the astrolabe written in English for his 10-year-old son Louis, they were reading the descendant of a device that Hypatia would have recognized on sight. The through line is not myth, it's mechanics. How she handled malice is also part of the legacy. The rumor that she delayed reconciliation between Orestes and Cyril demonstrates that the crowd knew her influence. It is not a compliment they meant to give, but it is data. Peter, the lector, did not pick a random pagan. He picked the one whose advice mattered. The tools used to kill her, ostraka, are hard to ignore as symbols. The sherds that carried calculations, marginalia, lists of expenses, quick notes now, weaponized into knives. It is tempting to treat that as the poignant last line of a film. It reads instead like a field note. Public learning in a politically electrified environment will always face the chance that the instruments of thought become projectiles. She knew that. She still walked to the lecture hall. The number of sources we have is not infinite, which makes each one sharper. Socrates, Scholasticus wrote about her in his ecclesiastical history around 430, a mere quarter century after her murder. That proximity matters. Damascius wrote a century later, which means he had hearsay in the tastes of his circle, but he also had the philosophical world's gossip network, which in antiquity is called tradition. The Suda in the 10th century compiled lists that had survived Byzantine wars and iconoclasm and bureaucrats. Cinesius wrote before she died. 9 or 10 letters to her survive depending on edition, and more letters talk about her to others. Philostorgius, an Arian historian of the 5th century, mentions her as well in fragments preserved by Photius. Put together, this is not a pile of legend. It is a moderate dossier. The numbers attached to her work have precision when we let them. Theon's edition of Euclid's Elements cleaned up book Fee's theory of proportion. That theory, from Eudoxus, allowed ratios of magnitudes without numbers, a way to do real analysis before decimals crashed the party. That mathematical culture is the one she kept alive. Diophantus's typical problem might be this: find two numbers, such that the sum and product satisfy given conditions, with no x and y but with skill in setting unknowns relative to knowns using Greek rhetorical algebra. Apollonius's conics book defines ellipse, parabola, and hyperbola using cutting cones at different angles, and then proves dozens of propositions about them. Ptolemy's Almagest book offers lunar theory good enough to drive eclipse predictions to within tens of minutes, using epicycle models. The astronomical canon the Suda mentions likely points to Ptolemy's handy tables. Practical extracts from the Almagest used for computation. Hypatia helped future readers not hate their lives while using them. Her daily reality included the tactile things now called maker culture. Students in her school would have known how to engrave a scale, how to polish a plate, how to inscribe a star's position with a punch, how to drill a pivot where the wreath would rotate smoothly, but not wobble. Metalwork and math made friends in her classroom, and the result was not just the right answer, but the right device. Alexandria sold boats and parchment, and formulas in equal measure. A philosopher who knew how to aim a sight across the star Canopus, knew how to get things done in a city that ran on shipping schedules and seasons. The Artesian winds hit around June. Regular as a metronome, Alexandria needed astronomers, not to do romance with the heavens, but to operate clocks for agriculture and prayer. She fulfilled that with a lecture on epicycles Tuesday and a calibrated hydroscope Thursday. Debunking myths does not drain the color. It intensifies it. Make room in the head for the way her school used geometry as therapy. The line straightens tangled thought. The circle reminds minds of the possibility of perfection in an era that had none. Remember the orchestra of sounds an astrolabe made when its components clicked. Thin metal on metal, rings aligning with ring, re-teeth, sliding over rim gradations, measured in degrees. The Alidade sweeping over a star's name, engraved in careful lettering. Envision a student glancing from the classroom roof to the horizon. Then, back to the instrument to measure the altitude of Sirius, called Sothis in Egypt, whose heliacal rising historically marked the Nile flood. Educational content, political context, environmental reality. None of this lives in the sepia of nostalgia. It's hardware, numbers, bodies in a city by the sea. Her fame, then, and now, is not an argument about whether ancient people allowed women to think. They did, sometimes, when the woman forced the issue with competence in public. Hypatia's story shows the cost and the payoff. She built things that outlasted the men who smashed her. She left patterns that could be followed. She drew students into a network not defined by creed, but by clarity. A bishop wrote to her when he needed an astrolabe. A bureaucrat listened when she explained what justice should do next. A historian praised her for making her sex an afterthought in front of a crowd. The city's zealots saw her centrality and took the route zealots always take when they suspect they are losing. They resorted to violence. Her body died. Her project did not. The cultural memory that followed her is instructive. John Toland, in 1720, wrote a short history of Hypatia, a pamphlet bristling with Enlightenment brio and aimed at the church, more than at the truth. Voltaire, being Voltaire, recycled the story with acid. Edward Gibbon mentioned her with the detachment of a man who loved decline and fall narratives almost as much as scandal. Carl Sagan's 1980 Cosmos episode reintroduced her to a mass audience, a generation that grew up watching a turtle-legged astronomer talk about the stars and intolerance in one velvety sentence. Each retelling amplified certain beats and smoothed others. Meanwhile, scholars of late antiquity in the 20th and 21st centuries did the actual work. Maria Julska's monograph, Hypatia of Alexandria, 1995, is a model of careful skepticism, Edward J. Watts's works on Alexandria and late antique intellectual life give a political map. Michael Deakin's research added data about her mathematical plausibility. Robert Penella's translations of Synesius's letters gave precise windows into her classroom. Today, she occupies a precise coordinate in the mental sky. People court her as a symbol and sometimes misuse her as a slogan, but the coordinates are still real. A teacher who influenced both Christian and pagan elites, a builder of astrolabes, an editor of the starry Bible of antiquity, the Almagest, a commentator on problem-solving that kept number theory's spirit alive in a millennium that needed it, a woman whose end became the opening line in a man's hagiography, a reminder that public intellect is not an abstract. It is a civic function that can trigger an immune response when power feels threatened. The most underappreciated achievement, though, might be an outcome that sounds dull to anyone addicted to novelty. She made old texts work for new students. Every history of science is full of flash. Eureka moments, apple trees, solar eclipses that spook armies. Scroll through the receipts, and the majority of forward movement came from this quieter skill, the capacity to translate, annotate, edit, illustrate, model, and keep the explanation alive, long enough for someone else to extend it. Hypatia did that so well that 15 centuries later, strangers still argue about her as if she just logged off a live stream. A historian like Socrates Scholasticus did not see her as a rebel. He put her on the page as the best philosopher of her time, valuable to the city, tragically victimized by the overzeal of men who thought piety was a replacement for law. He did not love paganism. He did love the idea that civic order should not be dictated by mobs. That should be the takeaway a city like Alexandria could have used during Lent in 415. It is the takeaway that any city could use now. He reported that after her death, Cyril's party was held responsible, and the church took a reputational hit. The assumption that zeal can kill without cost was punctured by the noise such acts make. The murder of a philosopher in broad daylight is never quiet. In the list of landmarks of her life, the numbers anchor the scenes. 355, 370. Hypatia born in Alexandria, into the household of Theon of Alexandria, mathematician, commentator, and teacher. 391. The Serapeum, destroyed under orders of Theodosius I. Alexandria's traditional pagan institutions gutted, public cults repressed or repurposed. 390s, 410s. Hypatia teaches mathematics and philosophy in Alexandria, writes commentaries on Diophantus, Apollonius, and astronomical works. Edits Ptolemy's Almagest, constructs and teaches the planispheric astrolabe and hydroscope. 410. Synesius becomes bishop of Ptolemy. His letters to Hypatia continue, discussing health, family, theology, and instruments. 400. 414th. Synesius dies. Bereavement in his letters beforehand hints at the human toll that rarely gets counted in syllabi. 412. 415. Cyril serves as Bishop of Alexandria, clashes with Prefect Orestes over jurisdiction, policy, and ideology. March 415. Hypatia murdered by a Christian mob, led by Peter the Lector. Body burnt at Cinaron. 439. 440. Socrates Scholasticus publishes Ecclesiastical History, including his account of Hypatia's public standing and death. c. 10th century. The Suda compiles entries, naming her commentaries and calling her a philosopher of exceptional skill. Those dates and works sketch a career arc as crisp as a geometric diagram. It started at a family table covered in manuscripts, peaked with packed lectures and elite correspondence, and ended at the hands of men who confused holy seasons with hunting seasons. The line that matters most stretches out beyond 415. Instruments, commentaries, and edited texts made their way through centuries of scribes. A mosque's muezzin and a monastery's bell ringer used times derived from tables Hypatia explained. A Kafkaesque bureaucracy in Constantinople tallied taxes with arithmetic trained in schools like hers. A sailor in the 12th century used latitude measured with an astrolabe that followed a design stream she kept unbroken. The appeal of myth is strong because it promises clean lines and satisfying catharsis. The reality of Hypatia is stronger because it gives something rarer, a model. Public intellect can be humble and hands-on. Commentary can be creation. Craft can be cosmic. Being a woman at the front of the room can be perfectly normal once competence has the floor, and the world remains the world enough that men with tiles can still ruin it on a Tuesday. That last part does not erase the others. The executioners did not get the last word. In the centuries after 415, the best minds of the Islamicate world translated, argued, calculated, and invented on top of the Greek foundation. In the centuries after that, scholars in Italy, France, England, and beyond recovered that material and built Renaissance and scientific revolution toys that Hypatia would have used before lunch and mastered before dinner. The chain contains many links. She did her part perfectly. When a letter from Synesius asks her to send a hydroscope, one can imagine the desk where she managed such orders. Stacks of papyrus, rolled and tied. A little chest with weights and fine tools. A half-finished reed propped against a jar. A copy of the Almagest open to a table of chords. Courier schedules in her head tied to the city's rhythm. That picture does not require a single invention. It's built from the debris of careful sources and the bones of a real city. That desk sits in the mind now because it held the instruments with which people found their way by the stars. The next time a star chart appears, or a museum displays a bronze astrolabe with little star pointers and Latin or Arabic labels, the lineage can be traced. Hipparchus derived projection. Ptolemy codified astronomy. Theon standardized. Hypatia taught, built, shipped, and explained. Synesius wrote, begged, learned, then preached and ruled a diocese, and, when necessary, repaired instruments. A 10th century artisan in Cordoba cast an astrolabe that turns the same way, just with different script and prayers. A 14th century English poet wrote a how-to guide for his child. A 21st century educator prints a cardboard astrolabe from the internet and uses it to demonstrate the night sky to a classroom under fluorescent lights. The circle closes. The reed spins. The numbers still fit. The philosopher's mantle might be in a museum case, but the mantle was never the point. The last scene of her life has been reenacted so often that the violence threatens to overshadow the craft. It is healthy to look at the craft for a long time. Stand in her school as a student lifts an astrolabe to cite the height of Canopus or Regulus. Hear the skin of that instrument click. See the student's eyes narrow, calculating, attentive. Step into the lecture where a problem from Diophantus is being broken into simpler pieces, where a sum of two rational numbers solving a given condition is built step by step, where a public learns to prefer clarity over slogans. Follow the teacher when she leaves that hall to advise a prefect, lay out a moral case, speak in sentences that cannot be put into a chant. Then understand why a man who thrives on chants feels threatened. The answer is not mystical. It's arithmetic. Her achievements, measured by objects and texts, hold steady in any weather, a named place in the transmission of Ptolemy's Almagest to later readers, through editing and teaching that survivors in manuscripts still tag, to the philosopher Hypatia. Commentaries on Diophantus and Apollonius that kept those works intelligible in centuries that did not have time for cleverness unless it paid off. A school that produced bishops, administrators, and scholars who wrote and built instruments and carried her approach out of Alexandria to Cyrene and beyond. Actual tools. Astrolabes constructed and used. Hydroscopes calibrated and shipped. Public authority. A woman recognized as a civic councillor in a city where such recognition did not come cheaply. The rest is everybody else's business. What polemicists do with her, what memorials try to cleanse, what icons try to polish. Her mathematical problems do not care. Planets do not move differently when mobs break things. The geometry of conics does not weep, but people built with those shapes, and students turned into adults by learning them. She taught them how. Socrates Scholasticus wrote that Alexandria hated her death. His phrase was that the event brought not a little opprobrium upon Cyril and the church in Alexandria. Even bitter cities know when they have crossed a line. That acknowledgement, centuries later, is worth something. A footnote in the long commentary of civic survival. A lemma in the proof that dazzlement at intellect can overcome fear of it. At least for long stretches, long enough to keep a generation's instruments turning. For anyone looking to put a label on her, pioneering female scholar, sounds fine, but accurate labels are never the point with a life like this. She did what scholars do when they are at their best. She made other people better at thinking and doing. She aimed instruments at the sky and dragged the sky just far enough down that hands could hold it. She made old texts new again without lying about them. She made public life more intelligent. She took the risk that comes with doing that work in public. She paid for it. The work remains more powerful because she did it while others hesitated. When a star is located on an astrolabe plate and its altitude read off with a little turning rule, the echo of her classroom is still audible. A quiet click from the edge of the past that says, this is how to line up earth and heaven, with attention, without panic, with joy. For our next story, we explore the scientific innovations of Alhazen, father of optics. A medieval scientist got himself declared insane by a headstrong caliph, dodged a possible execution, and then, while stuck under house arrest, wrote a 7-volume masterwork that yanked vision and light out of philosophy's grip and strapped them onto the lab bench. That person was Abu Ali Hassan ibn Ali Hassan, born in Basra around 965 C, dead in Cairo around 1040, and still interrupting dinner table arguments about what the eye actually does. The Nile started it. Around 1011, Ibn al-Haytham arrived in Cairo with an idea that sounded like a public works fantasy cut from a medieval TED Talk. He had proposed to regulate the Nile's catastrophic floods by building a dam in Upper Egypt, near Aswan. He delivered this plan to the Fatimid Caliph Al-Hakim Marala, a ruler whose reputation for volatility earned him footnotes and side-eye for 1,000 years. The Caliph called his bluff and ordered him to make it real. Ibn al-Haytham headed south, surveyed the Nile, watched the engineering nightmare unfold in real time, and realized the project was impossible with the materials, manpower, and logistics of the year 1011. The smart move in a sensible court would have been a frank project, debrief with budget revisions. Cairo in Al-Hakim's day did not specialize in sensible. The story, preserved by the 13th century biographers Al-Kifti and Ibn Abi Usaybiya, runs like a cautionary tale. Ibn al-Haytham feigned madness, convinced the authorities he was unfit for execution or responsibility, and was placed under supervised confinement in Cairo until Al-Hakim's death in 1021. House arrest turned out to be the best grant proposal he never wrote. He spent those years writing at a clip that would terrify modern tenure committees. He drafted, compiled, and revised treatises on optics, astronomy, mathematics, and epistemology. The real blockbuster landed around 1021. Kitab al-Manadir, the Book of Optics, 7 books deep, running from the nature of vision through reflection and refraction, and packed with experiments, geometrical proofs, and a systematic attack on ancient authority. Generations later, Latin scholars would call him Alhazen, or Alhazen, and his Book of Optics would burrow into European science through translations and anthologies. The 1572 Basel printing by Friedrich Risner, Opticae Thesaurus, Alhazen Arabis, would staple his name to the field. The opening move in his science of seeing takedown was simple and lethal. Ancient Greek heavyweights, like Euclid and Ptolemy, had suggested some version of extramission, meaning the eye sends out rays, meets the object, and vision happens. Intriguing and elegant, and also easy to roast with a few controlled setups. Ibn al-Haytham lined up candles, pinholes, mirrors, and dark rooms, and went on offense. Light, he argued and demonstrated, travels from luminous objects in straight lines. Objects are seen because light from them, or light reflected from them, enters the eye. That sounds tame to a 21st century brain soaked in physics class. But in 1021 this moved vision from metaphors to mechanics. He sliced the eye's job cleanly. The eye does not shoot sight. The eye receives light. The greatest tool in that campaign looked like a hack, and it still delights anyone who has ever poked a pinhole in a sheet of paper during an eclipse. He used a camera obscura, literally a dark chamber, with a tiny aperture. He did not invent it from nothing. Mosey School in China described pinhole imaging in the 5th century B, and Aristotle noted dappled, inverted images during eclipses in the 4th century B. Ibn al-Haytham turned the dark room into a quantitative device. Close the shutters, carve a hole just a few millimeters wide, and an upside-down projection of the bright outside world paints itself on the opposite wall. He showed that 2 holes make 2 images, not a fuzzy blend. He varied aperture size and distance to test brightness and sharpness. He used the setup to observe the 1021 solar eclipse safely. He extracted geometry from shadows and lines rather than feel-good poetic physics. A dark room became a loud statement about straight-line propagation. The eye followed. Earlier anatomists had placed visual power in the crystalline lens, like a throne for sight. Ibn al-Haytham treated the whole optical pathway: cornea, aqueous humor, crystalline lens, vitreous humor, and finally a sensitive surface at the back of the eye. He argued that the posterior structure, continuous with the optic nerve, receives the pattern and ships it to the brain, where perception is fashioned. He leaned on anatomy available in Arabic medicine, carved through common errors with a scalpel of geometry, and added psychophysics-style tests of illusion to show how the brain edits and sometimes misleads. The sun and the moon look bigger near the horizon than at the zenith, though their angular size barely changes. That is a mental construction trick, not a property of wandering celestial bodies. Dark adapted eyes exaggerate brightness changes. A bright field makes a grey patch look darker. Perception lies with swagger. He catalogued those deceptions across Book 3 and forced optical science to own its cognitive baggage. The experiments kept the pace of a binge-worthy montage. Burnished metal mirrors mapped out reflection. He approached spherical and parabolic mirrors like a geometry Olympian with a clipboard. From reflection's law, angle in equals angle out, he pushed to a nasty showpiece now known as Alhazen's problem. Given 2 points in a circular mirror, find the point on the circle where a ray from the first point reflects to the second, with equal angles to the normal. Students learn the answer with calculus and conic sections. 5 steps down the line, he managed it with classical constructions and acute cleverness, reducing it to finding intersections related to ellipses and hyperbolas and solving a 4th-degree equation. Medieval commentators grappled with his solution structure. Modern historians, including Roshdi Rashed and A. Mark Smith, have walked readers through that proof with admirable patience. It did not merely show off. It encoded real mirror behavior, and it showed that intricate light paths submit to calculation rather than mystery. Refraction gave him a harder climb. Light passing from air to water bends toward the normal. Air to glass bends too. Glass to air bends back away. He measured relative bending and experimented with transparent media, spheres filled with water and blocks of glass. He did not drop a clean formula for the sign of the angle being proportional to a constant across media. The law tagged by later European names like Snell and Descartes. Another mathematician in the same cultural world, Ibn Sal, around 984, had already articulated the correct relationship for lenses and burning mirrors. A sign law, a full 6 centuries before Willibrord Snell. The historical tangle is easy bait for mythmakers. Many popular treatments hand the law to Alhazen. That version delivers a satisfying hero narrative, but it cuts against the manuscripts. Ibn al-Haytham's refraction work is deep and experimental but does not state the general sign law. Ibn Sal does. Credit still lands heavy on Ibn al-Haytham for the design logic of refracting systems and for elevating refraction from a gimmick to an analyzable law-like behavior. He knew that spherical shapes caused aberrations and that some problem of focus required new shapes. His treatise on burning mirrors and lenses chewed on the focusing power of parabolas and hinted at aspheric corrections. The idea that a parabola concentrates parallel rays at a point comes through loudly in his discussions of burning mirrors, echoing the legend of Archimedes and his death rays, while moving beyond legend into engineering reality. He carried that refraction obsession into the sky. In a treatise on twilight, he concluded that the sun continues to light the upper atmosphere after it has dipped below the horizon. The sky glows because light scatters through a thick but finite shell of air. Observations and geometry delivered a number that modern astronomy still uses. Astronomical twilight ends when the sun's center is about 18 degrees below the horizon. Scholars debate his exact figure, with reconstructions of his analysis placing his threshold around 18 to 19 degrees. Either way, the method deserves the spotlight. He tied a perceptual phenomenon to a measurable solar depression angle with repeatable observation, not just cosmological storytelling. He also argued that the moon shines by reflected sunlight, not by its own light. Greek astronomers, like Aristarchus, had said this long before. But Ibn al-Haytham wrote a compact, mathematically flavored argument with observational test points. He tackled the Milky Way and insisted it lies far beyond the atmosphere, another assignment of a familiar glow to a distant cause, based on geometric reasoning rather than atmospheric folklore. The book reads like a lab notebook crossed with a geometry textbook, crossed with an anti-authority manifesto. He wrote that truth is sought for its own sake, and that the scholar must make himself an enemy of what he reads, attack it from every side, and even suspect himself of bias. The phrasing varies with translation, but the punch lands the same. A. I. Sabra's edition and translation of the optics captures that voice. And A. Mark Smith's multivolume translations tease apart his experimental program with surgical clarity. For anyone raised on the idea that science moves from armchairs to apparatus only in the 17th century, Ibn al-Haytham's optics rubs that timeline with sandpaper. Controlled experiments appear again and again. A single aperture versus double aperture. Direct versus oblique incidence. Mirrors with different curvatures. Eye responses in light and dark. What he did not have was calculus, photodiodes, or vacuum tubes. What he absolutely had was the habit of isolating variables, manipulating conditions, and reporting results so others could repeat the trial. His notes shout that heritage across a millennium. He did not write optics in a vacuum. He was a math polymath whose catalogue sprawled. Historian listing wars happen over his exact output because manuscript survival is messy, and medieval bibliographies do not settle on one number. Ibn Abi Ustabieh wrote that he produced about 96 works. Later cataloguers expanded the count past 180 treatises with varying levels of confidence. Not all survive. The Book of Optics remains the crown, but he also wrote Doubts Concerning Ptolemy, where he took a hard line against Ptolemaic astronomy and optics when geometry contradicted observation. He wrote on the shape of the eclipse, describing how an image of the sun changes shape as it passes behind the moon. He wrote on the rainbow and halo, giving early attempts at the causes of arcs and rings in the sky. Kamal Din Farsi and Catchbrust al-Din Shirazi would later build a more accurate rainbow explanation around 1300 using double refraction in raindrops and internal reflection. But Ibn al-Haytham's atmospheric optics offered vital pieces. He wrote on light and on the light of the moon. He composed works in number theory, conic sections, and mechanics. He lived that 11th century scholar life, where a single brain buys tickets to every show. The inherited myths about him deserve a quick cleanup, because they spread like chain emails, dressed in scientific robes. The first myth says he invented the camera in the sense of a lens-based, photosensitive box. His camera obscura is a pinhole projection system, not a film camera or digital camera. It supplied a drawing aid and an imaging principle. Chinese Mohist texts before 300 BICE knew pinhole imaging. Medieval Arabic writers between the 10th and 11th centuries refined it. Renaissance artists and scientists from Brunelleschi to Leonardo used the technique. The chemical camera waited for 19th century light-sensitive plates. Ibn al-Haytham turned a curiosity into a tool and wrapped it in analytics. That is a scientific legacy, not a single engineered gadget. The second myth hands him the title inventor of the scientific method in a modern, full-blown sense, complete with probability, error theory, and hypothesis testing protocols. That overreach erases everyone from the Hellenistic areas to the 17th century savants and beyond. He did something narrower and just as vital. He formulated a rigorously experimental way to settle claims about light and vision. He married geometry to apparatus and made performance in controlled conditions outrank authority. His prefaces give the philosophy sharp edges. His procedures make it a habit. Historians like David C. Lindbergh, Nader, El-Bizri, Sabra, and Smith have mapped these moves carefully. They mark him as a founder of experimental optics. That stance has traction, without collapsing him into a one-man invention of science trope. The third myth pins the sine law of refraction on him. The correct credit flows to Ibn Sal, in 1984 for the general law and to later European rediscoveries. Ibn al-Haytham's refraction chapters still matter because they sketch detailed ray paths through media, outline the bending mechanism in everyday terms, study multiple refractions, and confront real optical errors. Field grows because many contributors till the soil and draw lines across it. Another chestnut claims he served as vizier of Basra. That would be a neat bullet point, but contemporary documentation does not back it. Al-Kifti described him as trained in theology and mathematics in Basra, with a knack for public demonstrations and problem-solving. He clearly loved big civic projects. In theory, the Nile fiasco proves how dangerously those theories intersected with palace politics. A grand political office is not a secure conclusion from the surviving sources. The myth pleases modern audiences because it shows a scientist who also runs a city. That appeal says more about modern anxieties than 11th century biographies. Also, he did not build a dam on the Nile. A dam did appear at Aswan, but it arrived in 1902 under British engineers, measured about 1,900 meters long and 54 meters high, and had nothing to do with a Basran polymath's field trip in 1011. Al-Hakim's temper helped convert a civil engineering misadventure into the greatest sabbatical in the history of physics. The story's best one-liner writes itself. The Book of Optics reads, not a random dump. Book I handles light in general, and the intromission theory. Books 2 and 3 drill down into vision and visual judgment, including distance, size, shape, and illusions. Books I and V take up reflection from plane, spherical, and parabolic mirrors, and the geometry of images. Books Phi and Veer cover refraction in different media, atmospheric effects, and quantitative analysis where the lab allowed. Along the way, he used controlled light sources, apertures of known sizes, distances set by rulers and strings, polished mirrors with specified curvatures, and water tanks with measured depths. The man was building optics like a carpenter with a chest of tools, rather than a poet with a golden pen. One gloriously specific episode anchors his case, that light travels in straight lines. He placed a candle in front of a screen pierced by a small circular hole. Behind the screen, he set a second white screen, where an inverted image of the candle flame appeared. He then made a second nearby hole and saw two images. He blocked one hole and saw one image vanish. He widened an aperture and recorded that the image brightened but blurred. He varied distances and recorded how the image size scaled. Each move knocked more nails into the coffin of the old emissionist model. If sight rays came from the eye, the walls of the dark room would have had to shoot out an image, a carnival effect that defied common sense even in the 11th century. But common sense without apparatus is slippery. The camera obscura stabilized it. In the eye chapter, he studied animal eyes and pointed out how the cornea refracts light before it even reaches the lens. He argued that oblique rays undergo different refractions, and that only some rays from each point contribute effectively to vision. He introduced the idea of the perpendicular or radial ray being most effective, because it undergoes minimal bending. The picture he drew edges toward an optical system that converges rays on a sensitive surface. He placed the seat of visual sensation not in the lens alone, but farther back in tissue tied to the optic nerve. Johannes Kepler, in 1604, would complete the picture mathematically, explaining that a real inverted image forms on the retina and that the brain interprets it. And Kepler cited Alhazen with respect. A millennium-long relay race carried that baton. He also embraced ugly optical truths that later designers would wrestle with for centuries. Spherical surfaces do not focus all parallel rays to a single point. Spherical aberration wrecks the dream of perfect focus. Parabolic shapes fix the problem for parallel rays, but parabolas are not trivial to grind or polish. He recognized trade-offs in mirror and lens design that live in every camera lens manual today. Even the word manual sat out the party for 800 years, but the concept of file, this under imperfections, is pure Alhazen. On the social side, he lived the bookish hustle. After Al-Hakim's death in 1021, the pretense of insanity ended. He took on copying manuscripts for pay and kept writing. Copies of his work spread through the Eastern Mediterranean. A Latin translation of his optics appeared in the 13th century, probably in Spain or Sicily, where teams chewed through Arabic science with the fervor of open-source contributors. Roger Bacon quoted him repeatedly in the 1260s. Watello's perspective around the 1270s reads like an Alhazen fan remix. John Peckham's Perspectiva Communis built classroom optics around him. When Risner published the Opticate Thesaurus in 1572, he bound Alhazen with Vitello and made early modern Europe eat perspective theory for breakfast. Kepler then adjudicated retinal imaging in the 1600s, with an explicit nod to Alhazen's foundations. Descartes wrote on refraction, with similar debts in mind. If northern Italy's artists learned to draw with rational perspective, that was a cultural cousin of the same idea sold by these optical treatises. Rays behave in ways geometry can own. He ran headlong into the sociology of knowledge, long before that phrase bloomed in graduate seminars. Scholars up and down the Mediterranean adored Ptolemy's optics, because Ptolemy's geometry felt like a warm bath. Alhazen's doubts concerning Ptolemy waded in and turned the taps cold. When theory and observation collided, Ptolemy's authority lost. When Ptolemy's models presumed extramission, they tripped on the candle experiments. Authority received the respect of a citation, and then the suction cup kiss of a withdrawal. It is very recognizable behavior to anyone who has ever torn down favorite notes after a lab meeting, because the equipment said something rude about your idea. His humor does not jump off the page as jokes, but the episode with the caliph reads like a gallows comedy with a scientist at the center. The man pitched a full-scale engineering miracle to a ruler known for impulsive acts, got an imperial go-ahead, then treated feigned insanity as a survival plan, and inadvertently created the finest optics lab environment the medieval Islamic world had produced. He found the only safe place in Cairo to play with dangerous ideas. A quiet room where no one expects responsibility. Peak 11th century life hack energy. The source trail tells a careful reader where bragging rights end and sober history begins. The Nile story appears in al-Kifsi's Tartrik al-Hukama and Ibn Abi Eusebius, Uyuna Lanbarfi, Abakat al-Api. Scholars like I, Sabra, Roshdi Rasht, and Nader el-Bizri have walked through those texts, measured the plausibility, and handled the legend versus fact distinction with caution. The text of the Book of Optics survives in Arabic and Latin manuscripts, with a major modern Arabic edition, an English translation in Sabra's volumes, and in Mark Smith's massive English translations, and commentaries published in 2001 and following. UNESCO's International Year of Light in 2015 featured Ibn al-Haytham as a centerpiece of a Millennium of Optics celebration, pointing back to the car 1015, 1020, one period, as a turning point. Historians of medieval science from David C. Lindbergh to Charles Burnett have tracked how his pages seeped into Latin Europe, while modern optics textbooks continue to present his fundamental experiments as early validations of ray behavior. Atmospheric optics delivers one more signature Ibn al-Haytham vibe, Paint over a wonder with a calculation and watch it look better, not worse. He wrote that twilight persists because the sun lights the upper air and that the limit intensity slides down to darkness when the sun descends beyond roughly 18 degrees below the horizon. That figure remains the standard in observational astronomy, used to classify civil, nautical, and astronomical twilight at 6, 12, and 18 degrees. He plotted the depression of the sun, cross-checked the sky brightness nightly, and mapped a human experience to a celestial angle. Then he argued that the atmosphere has a finite height, because beyond a certain depression no path remains for the sun's rays to scatter to the observer. That is primitive radiative transfer done with geometry and patient observation. He refused to leave the glow as a poetic flourish. He treated it like data. He also built a user's guide to visual errors. Objects seen obliquely appear distorted because the shape of the visual field changes under refraction at the cornea and lens. Lines that meet at a corner sometimes look curved under certain conditions. Bright objects surrounded by dark appear larger or sharper than they are. The moon illusion is not caused by real changes in the moon's size or distance across the night, but by the brain anchoring the horizon as a frame and comparing size cues. He did not couch this in terms of neurons and Bayesian priors. He lined up props, collected responses, and showed which conditions matter. That style became the diagnostic heart of experimental psychology. 9 centuries later, his mathematics could get spicy. Alhazen's problem belongs in a calculus course, and his conic sections work reads like Euclid with a speed limit removed. His geometry of paraboloids to collect rays into a point amounts to mid-level design for solar concentrators centuries before solar farms and rooftop dishes. He struggled with aberrations and image positions in a way that would take Johannes Kepler and Christian Huygens to settle. Kepler accepted the inverted retinal image and leaned on Alhazen's theory that the brain reconstructs. Huygens would hand-wave wavefronts. Newton would go ballistic with prisms. Through those moves, Ibn al-Haytham's geometry remains audible. The man even had a small but potent photometry vibe. He described how brightness depends on the size of the aperture and the luminance of the source, mapped inverse relationships with distance, and insisted that impressions of brightness are not linear with actual intensity. That intuition matches later psychophysical laws like Weber-Fechner, even though he never plotted a log curve in 1021 Cairo. The impulse to separate brightness out as a measurable property and to relate it mathematically to geometry and distance is classic Alhazen. In short form, a list of crunchy specifics lands like a percussion line. Basra birth, circa 965. Cairo death, around 1040-1041. Journey to Egypt, around 1011. Under Caliph al-Hakim, feigned insanity to survive a failed Nile dam plan, as reported by al-Kifti and Ibn Abi Usaybiya. House arrest through 1021. Book of Optics in 7 books completed around 1021, with an experimental core. Camera obscura used to project an inverted image and study eclipses. Intromission theory replacing extramission with laboratory consistency. Alhazen's problem in reflection turned into a 4th-degree geometric solution. Detailed but non-Snell refraction analyses. Twilight threshold measured around 18 to 19 degrees. Treatises on the moon's reflected light, atmospheric phenomena, and visual illusions. Latin reception through translations. In the 13th century, giant influence on Roger Bacon, Witello, and Peckham. Risner's 1572 Opticae Thesaurus, cementing his European presence. Kepler's 1604 work further clarifying retinal imaging while pointing back to Alhazen. UNESCO's 2015 celebration of a millennium of optics, highlighting him as a founding force. Not a lens camera inventor, not a one-man inventor of the scientific method, a ferociously methodical lab worker before the word lab had its modern ring. Cairo, in the early 11th century, gave him vibrancy and danger. Al-Hakim built mosques, founded libraries, and also issued edicts that undercut merchants and scholars without warning. That mix produced biographies that read like binge thrillers. Ibn al-Haytham sidestepped the headman and transformed captivity into creative focus. He lived under the Fatimids and his Ismaili Shia dynasty that ran an intellectual infrastructure with massive libraries and translation hubs. That context mattered. It made access to Greek and Arabic texts possible and made long treatises economically viable. It also meant that a brilliant Basran mathematician could pitch something as improbable as damming the Nile and actually get travel orders. The Latin story reads like receipts and citations stacking over centuries. Around 1200 to 1250, translators across Spain and Sicily turned Arabic science into Latin. The Book of Optics, by then usually called De Aspectibus in Latin circles, started popping up in manuscripts. Roger Bacon's Opus Maius around 1267 practically shouts his name and uses his ideas as a foundation for natural philosophy. Witello's perspective around 1270 reorganized and extended him. John Peckham's Perspectiva, communists turned that material into compact teaching notes that stuck through the 17th century. Kepler read these and exploited the conceptual resources to convert optical rays into a fully fledged theory of image formation on a curved retina. That 12-step program lands in modern physics classrooms, but the first steps speak Arabic. The most enticing psychological tell in his pages is his willingness to beat up his own intuitions. He admitted the brain pastes in distance cues and shape cues, that steep angles distort, that lenses lie, and that eyes betray under stress. He wrote the scientific equivalent of a no-makeup selfie for perception. That kind of honesty travels slowly across centuries because it can feel like nihilism to a culture that wants the senses to deliver truth on a silver plate. Instead, he gave a method for when to trust and when to verify. The method includes controlling light, measuring angles, comparing with geometry, and repeating under altered conditions. That remains the blueprint. His career also helps kill the idea that the medieval Islamic world merely preserved Greek texts for Europe. He did not just archive Euclid and Ptolemy. He interrogated them, rewrote them, and occasionally dismantled them. Greek optics walked in as a guest. It left as raw material for a new craft. That craft traveled to Latin Europe and seeded a textbook revolution that led to Renaissance art techniques, mapping of perspective, new instruments, and experimental physics. Even the etymology carries drama. Europeans encountered him as Alhazen in Latin manuscripts, an orthographic choice that confuses modern spellers. By the 19th century, scholars pushed Alhazen as a more accurate Latinization of Alhazen. Roshdi Rasht, Lindbergh, Sabra, and Smith tend to use Ibn al-Haytham in modern scholarship. UNESCO used Ibn al-Haytham in 2015 to emphasize his Arabic identity. Deep cuts in the bibliography show printed Latin Risner editions, gluing the Latin name to an optical tradition that then fed into Kepler and Descartes. His work chased practical spin-offs, even if he spoke mostly as a theorist. Artists in Europe used perspective rules that came from the geometrical optics tradition he amplified. Surveyors and architects exploited sightlines and ray diagrams in their craft. Mirror makers and lens grinders had a more rigorous target for what counts as a good surface. Physicians read improved eye anatomy, in medical treatises seeded by Arabic medicine and optics. Astronomers used twilight thresholds in observation schedules. Mariners checked astronomical tables, improved by a better understanding of refraction near the horizon. Even alchemy like photometry gained footholds as instrument makers tinkered with apertures and light levels. Arguments about historical priority keep modern readers entertained, but the thickest through line gives credit to method and clarity. Ibn al-Haytham faced the same two devils that haunt modern lab life. One devil dresses up as authority and offers easy peace of mind. The other dresses up as perception and promises obvious truth. He distrusted both outfits. His optics erected a fence of measurement around perception and put authority into quarantine. The late-life snapshot looks ordinary after so much drama. He survived the Al-Hakim episode, wrote like a printing press in human form, copied texts professionally, and died in Cairo around 1040 or 1041. He left manuscripts scattered across libraries from Cairo to Damascus to European collections. Scholars have identified Arabic manuscripts in Leiden, Cairo, and Istanbul, and Latin copies in Paris and Oxford. His name kept appearing when Western Europe tried to turn sight into science in the 13th through 17th centuries. Then the 19th and 20th centuries woke up to his method as historians filtered medieval science through the new obsession with empiricism. In 2015, a global celebration of light and optics raised his profile beyond academic circles, reintroducing him as part of a shared heritage for physics classrooms worldwide. His reputation as the father of optics earns a stamp even under skeptical audit. He did not conjure the subject out of vacuum. Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, and others laid seeds. Chinese, Indian, and Hellenistic thinkers had their own plants in the garden. Ibn al-Haytham pruned, replanted, invented new gardening tools, and produced a structured, experimental, mathematically reasoned orchard. That merits paternity language in a field that loves ancestral metaphors. A dam never rose from his Nile plan. A bridge did rise between philosophy and experiment. His greatest civil engineering feat sat in a room with a pinhole. It channeled the flood of light into a comprehensible stream, taught the eye to accept that it receives rather than emits, and taught the mind to separate brightness from truth. He did not make sight easy. He made it honest. The world looked sharper afterward. The best chef's kiss detail sits in the footnotes. He loved to bracket grand theories with tight apparatus. A screen, a hole a few millimeters wide, a candle, a ruler, and a scribe's patience, a polished metal mirror, a compass, and a straight edge, a bowl of water, and a bright afternoon. Those toolkits narrate the practical side of high-minded philosophy. They make optics feel less like an ivory tower and more like a hardware store with geometry graffited on the walls. Centuries later, students still stand in dark rooms with pinholes, still see the upside-down world painted on a wall, still feel the small jolt of recognition that comes when a principle becomes an image. That jolt runs a lineage through Basra and Cairo, through Latin hogbacks and Renaissance workshops, through the letter forms of Optica Thesaurus, through Kepler's sharp Latin prose. Ibn al-Haytham sits near the origin of that line, equal parts experimentalist and geometer, equal parts court survivor and method builder. The Nile spared him, the Caliph caged him, and physics thanked him. Our journey through history continues with the rise of the Celtic kingdoms, mystery and might. Rome burned once because a group of people the Greeks called Keltoi strolled in with bright shields, long swords, and zero respect for city limits. A leader the Romans later called Brennus took a warband to the river Allia and then into Rome itself. The story of Vae Victis, woe to the vanquished, comes from Livy and is probably dramatic frosting, but the sack was real. 2 centuries later, in 279 BS, another Brennus tried to loot Delphi, got hammered by snow, locals, and Greek counterattacks, and left a legend of hubris in icy ruins. By 51 BS, Julius Caesar was building nearly 24 miles of siege lines around Alasia to choke off Vercingetorix of the Arverni. The headline is simple. The Celtic world forced every great power of classical Europe to take them seriously. That word, Celtic, hides a mess. In antiquity, it meant language and cultural style, not a passport. The Greeks wrote Keltoi, the Romans Celte or Galli. These communities were never a single nation. They were a spread of languages and lifeways from Iberia to Anatolia, tangled into networks of trade, alliances, rivalries, and very loud feasts. Myths of one big Celtic empire go down easy like mead, but the receipts show local kings, regional confederations, and shifting pecking orders, not a central throne room. The earliest spark that looks like the beginning of actual kingdoms glows in the Alps and the Danube Valley. Around 800–450 BS, archaeologists label a world Hallstatt after a salt mine site in Austria. Salt sounds boring until it is money. Salt preserved meat, secured alliances, and pumped out a surplus that turned into gold torques, long iron swords, and chamber burials bold enough to make pharaohs peek over a shoulder. At Bix in Burgundy, a woman was buried around 500 BS, with a 208-kilogram bronze crater big enough to drown a party. At Hochdorf in Baden-Württemberg, a 5th-century Barsch chieftain reclined on a bronze couch while 9 drinking horns hung like party invitations. At Globerg in Hesse, a figure sometimes called the Prince faced eternity beside a sculpted sandstone statue wearing a swoop of a leaf crown. These weren't fairy kings with antlers. They were real elites with trade ties to Greek Massalia, Marseille, whose amphorae turn up far inland. Feasting gear is politics in metal form. Then, around 450 BS, the Latin style takes over, named for a lakeside site in Switzerland, where swords, shields, and fibulae glowed back into light in the 19th century. Designs curl like vines and spiral like a jam session. Mobility spikes, long slashing swords catch the sunlight. Helmets sprout bird crests and horns in a way that says, intimidation as performance art, not horned Vikings, which is a later myth from a different neighborhood. The earliest chainmail discovered by archaeologists shows up in 3rd century BS Celtic contexts, and Diodorus Siculus in the 1st century credited the Gauls with mail armor that the Romans later loved enough to make standard issue as the Lorica Hamata. 3 details: mail armor, metalwork, and massive feasts scream organized, wealthy, and not shy about it. The first Celtic kingdoms, visible in text, aren't neat states with clean borders, but some had kings with names, coinage, and diplomacy sharp enough to give senators migraines. In central Gaul, the Arverni flexed in the 2nd century BS under Luernius and his son Bituitus. Athenaeus, citing the philosopher Posidonius, says Luernius threw down so much coin he poured it into a trench for onlookers. A stunt like a 2nd century BS influencer, meet and greet, but with silver instead of selfies. In 121 Bituitus went to war with Rome and got captured by Gnaeus Domitius, Ahenobarbus, and Quintus, Fabius, Maximus, Alabrogicus. That loss trimmed Arvernian swagger, but it proves there was such a thing as a Gallic king who could lead, tax, and make treaties, not just a committee of feuding cousins. Across the Alps, the Insubres and Boy fought Romans for centuries. At Telamon in 225 Bus, Roman legions under Gaius Atilius Regulus and Lucius Aemilius Pappus smashed a large Confederate army of Gauls on the Tuscan coast, killing tens of thousands and ending any fantasy of a second sack of Rome. The Roman Senate probably exhaled deeply and then got back to worrying about Carthage. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Alps, the kingdom of Noricum operated a functioning diplomatic machine. Noricum traded iron and accepted a Roman alliance, formal enough to be acknowledged by writers like Strabo. Inscriptions preserve names like King Voccio, a figure who likely ruled near the late 1st century BC. Noricum's existence undermines that lazy stereotype of Celts as eternal anarchists. They ran a branded kingdom with borders, coinage, and embassies. If that seems far-flung, the plot takes a wilder turn in the Balkans. After that bottlenecked catastrophe near Delphi, some Gauls founded a kingdom at Tylis in Thrace in the 270 SBs. Polybius names Commontorius as a founding leader and Cavarus as a later king, who managed diplomacy with the Greek city of Byzantium. Tylis hung on until 212 BC, when the Thracians erased it, but for decades a Celtic monarchy ran the toll booth on the European side of the Bosporus. And then there is Anatolia. In 277 Spas, a group of Gauls crossed into Asia at the invitation of Hellenistic kings who both feared and hired them. The tribes Tolistobogi, Tectosiges, and Trochimi settled in central Anatolia, and the region became known as Galatia. By the 1st century BC, Diatrus was ruling the Galatian kingdom, playing Roman politics like a high-stakes card shark. Cicero complained about him in letters. Caesar toyed with him. Pompey courted him. After Diatarus, Amyntas of Galatia ruled until 25 BC, when Augustus pulled the administrative plug and folded Galatia into a Roman province. That is a fully documented Celtic kingdom inside the Roman imperial story, not a side note. The continental picture never resolves into a single map colour because Caesar interrupted it. His Commentarii de Bello Gallico, written in the 50s BC, deliver both a war diary and a masterclass in spin. He writes about the Aedui, Rome's brothers and kinsmen, with a tone that blurs ally with client state. He names Divitius Cacus, an Aeduan aristocrat and druid who visited the Roman Senate around 60 BC as a serious diplomatic operator. He hammers the Helvetii, who attempted a mass migration in 58 BC under a leader named Augetorix, and forces them back to their homeland after a campaign that sets the narrative tone for the rest of his conquest. He elevates Vercingetorix into the face of Pan-Gallic resistance in 52 BC, a leader who understood the power of scorched earth and the necessity of urban fortresses called oppida. Bibracton, Montbouvray, 135 hectares of hilltop anatity. Gergovia near modern Clermont-Ferrand, Avaricum at Bourges, and finally, Alesia. At Alesia, Caesar's engineering corps went feral. 2 concentric lines of fortifications boxed the city in and kept relief armies out, an inner circumvallation about 18 kilometres and an outer contravallation near 21 kilometres, dotted with towers, trenches, and nasty ground traps called Kippi and Lilia. It looked like a fortified hamster maze for humans, and it worked. Vercingetorix surrendered to save lives. The aftermath didn't erase Gallic elites. It rerouted them through Roman cities and Latin inscriptions. The Civitas Arvanorum, centered later at Augustan Metamertum, Clermont-Ferrand. The Remi of Reims leaned into Roman friendships so hard their city Jura Cortorum, became the seat of the governor of Belgica. Gaulish language didn't vanish overnight. The Coligny calendar, a 2nd century C bronze tablet from eastern Gaul, preserves a lunisolar schedule in Gaulish, using Latin letters. A 1st century C lead tablet from Chemalières, near Clermont-Ferrand, records a prayer in Gaulish. Jerome in the late 4th century noted that the Galatians in Anatolia sounded like the people around Trier, which is a linguistic time machine in a single sentence. Before Rome arrived in force, west of the Channel, southern Britain had its own gallery of coin-issuing kings, coins stamped with names like Adamerus, Tusciovanus, and Cunobelinus mark real authority on the ground. Cunobelinus of the Catavellani, ruling roughly at 1040. Minted coins at Camulodunum, Colchester, and traded so hard with Rome that Suetonius later remembered him as Britannorum Rex. Verica of the Atrebates ruled further south until he fled to Rome, a detail that politely explains why Emperor Claudius finally conquered Britain in 43 C. The royal brand strategy looked increasingly Roman. Royal palaces at Fishbourne, princely burials with imported goods, and Iron-Age chariots that Caesar described dashing around in smoke and noise like tactical sports cars with scythes. Chariots mattered in Britain far longer than in Gaul, a local signature that Caesar noticed because his cavalry got spooked by the sound. The Roman takeover did not end every British monarchy. For a while it multiplied them under the cozy label, client king. Togidubnus, Tacitus writes Tiberius Claudius Cogidubnus, enjoyed a long career as faithful friend of Rome, honoured on a marble inscription at Chichester. Cartimandua of the Brigantes ruled northern lands as a client queen who handed the Roman general a trophy named Curatarchus in 51 C. That trade-off was calculated. Stability for Rome, leverage for a queen who had to keep both noble factions and empire smiling. It worked until it didn't. When Cartimandua's marriage imploded and her ex-husband Venutius led a rebellion, Roman troops intervened. Then came the revolt that still sounds like thunder. In 60 or 61 C, after Roman officials flogged Boudica of the Iceni and assaulted her daughters, details preserved by Tacitus in his Annals and by Cassius Dio in a more theatrical version. The Iceni and Trinovantes burned Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. Dio's body counts 70,000, 80,000 dead in 3 cities. Read like rhetorical fire, but the ash layers and blackened streets in the archaeology speak for themselves. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, fresh from a punitive trip to Mona, Anglesey, reassembled his shattered army, chose a field with a narrow front, and broke the Britons with discipline and Pila. Boudica died soon after. The Iceni monarchy ended, and for centuries Britain's Celtic story blended into roads, forts, and Latin graffiti on tiles. Kingdoms went underground, as civitates with councils and magistrates, and Celtic elites quietly learned to read accounts in Latin while keeping ancestral lore alive in the background. The shape of Celtic kingship then crawled out of the rubble of Rome in the 5th century, like a tough plant through a cracked mosaic. In the west and the north of Britain, in Ireland, and across the Channel in Armorica, soon to be Britain, kingship reappeared, not as a copy of the old tribal model, and not as a clone of Roman provinces, but as something in between. In the Welsh-speaking West, kingdoms gelled out of post-Roman power bases. Gwynedd coalesced in northwest Wales, with its court in places like Deganwy, and later Aberystwyth. Maelgwn Gwynedd died a villain by Gildas in his De Excidio, et Conquestu Britanniae around 540, dominated the western scene before dying in a plague around 547. South of Gwynedd, Powys held the middle, with Offa's Dyke in the late 8th century carving a monumental earthwork around 240 kilometres long in surviving stretches between Mercia and Welsh lands. In the southwest, Dumnonia sprawled into what later became Cornwall and Devon. Kings from Dumnonia show up in British and Welsh tradition, and archaeology drops a dead giveaway. A Tintagel on a Cornish clifftop, 5th tag, 6th century shards of imported amphorae and fine ware from the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa tell a story of elites who could still funnel trade from far-off coasts to Atlantic headlands after Rome pulled its legions. North of the Roman wall country, the Old North, Yer Hen Ogledd, sprouted kingdoms with poetic afterglow, raged under Urien in the late 6th century, stood in modern Cumbria and southwest Scotland. Gododin, anchored at the fortress at Dunedin, Edinburgh, sent warriors to their grim appointment at Cattraeth. A battle later memorialised in Y Gododin, a poem recorded in a later manuscript, but echoing real places and names. Elmet persisted around Leeds, Strathclyde, centred at Old Clut, Dumbarton Rock, a 73-metre plug of volcanic basalt with cliffs dropping into the River Clyde, endured with grit. In 870, Vikings from Dublin under Amlaib and Imar besieged Dumbarton for 4 months, broke it, and shipped people and loot back to Ireland. But the kingdom's centre shifted upriver and continued as a player into the 11th century. Further north, Pictland ran its own scorecard. The Picts weren't a different race. They were a network of northern peoples, whose language sits on the Brythonic branch of Celtic, with some debate over an earlier stratum. Their stones, carved with a menagerie of symbols, like the double disc and Z-rod, the Pictish beast, salmon, and mirrors, refuse to yield instant translations. One thing is loud. Their kings mattered. Bridie MacBilly, sometimes labelled Bridie III, smashed Northumbria at the battle recorded by Bede near Dunaikin Moss. In 685, Dunnectan, also called Nectansmere, killing King Egfrith and snuffing the northward creep of Anglo-Saxon power. A century and a half later, Gaelic and Pictish lines tangled in new ways. A king named Synaid MacAlpin, Kenneth MacAlpin, in later tradition, appears in the 840s as ruler of both Scots, of Dal Riata and Picts. A hinge moment that eventually produces the kingdom called Alba. The sterile fight over whether he personally committed a mass royal dinner party ambush sits in the realm of legend. The political fact is clear enough. By the later 9th century, a Gaelic-speaking kingship unified much of North Britain. Ireland never had Rome, telling it where to build a forum, which meant its kingship developed on indigenous lines, with a level of continuity that stuns. The basic building block was the two, a petty kingdom with its own under overkings, rich, and sometimes a claimant to an island-wide high kingship, the law tracks, later compiled into the Censures Mar, spill long pages on cattle, honour prices, eric, fosterage, and rights. The structure was personal and federated, not territorial in the later feudal sense, but it produced heavy hitters. The Uae-Nail dynasties dominated the north and Midlands from the 6th century onward. Darmet Mac Serbail died around 565, a figure on the edge of firm history and earlier cycles. Edmac Muarec died in 598 as a claimant to the High Kingship, the 7th century Battle of Magrath, Moira in 600, and pinned down the order of things. Domno Macaido of the Senal Neogain within the northern Ue Neo defeated Congol Karsh of the Dal Rad and his allies, including forces from Dal Riata. That victory consolidated Ue Nail preeminence for generations. Scattered through Irish and Scottish West Coast rock runs another story, this time in Ogham. That alphabet slashes along a stone's edge marking consonants and vowels, shows up on more than 400 stones in Ireland from the 4th to the 7th century, especially in Kerry and Cork. Names of men and their fathers line up like introductions at a royal gathering. Across the Irish Sea in Wales, Ogham inscriptions sit side by side with Latin ones, quiet proof of Irish settlement and bilingual elites in Dyfed and Gwent. At Dinad in Aragil, the seat of the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriata, a rock bears a carved footprint used in royal inaugurations, and an Ogham inscription that keeps scholars honest about just how literate that landscape could be. Dalriata itself, stretching across the North Channel, was no LARP group. Aidan Maggabrain, ruling say, 574, 608, fought so hard that Bede wrote about him a century later. He clashed with Ethelfrith of Northumbria and got beaten at Degstan in 603, a moment that slowed Gaelic power on the British mainland but did not erase it. Iona, founded in 563 by Columba, became a monastery that minted saints' lives and artwork, a lighthouse that flashed signals to Picts, Gaels, and even to Lindisfarne in Northumbria, where Irish-trained monks brought the gospel with a sideways haircut and a calendar argument. That so-called Celtic church was not a separate denomination or theology, and the label deserves a retirement party with polite applause. The differences were practical. How to calculate Easter, what shape to shave the monastic tonsure, and got hashed out famously at Whitby in 664 when Northumbria chose Rome's computation. Irish, Welsh, and Breton monasteries lit up the map with scholarship and metalwork anyway. The Book of Kells, c. 800, looks like a manuscript, did curls in the gym. The ringed crosses of Ireland and Scotland, the so-called Celtic cross, rose from monastic yards without any need to manufacture a rebellious brand against Rome. Over in Brittany, the word Armorica started to slide off maps, and Brittany slid on as migrants from Britain rolled into a Roman province gone soft. Place name prefixes advertised the newcomers: plough for parishes, lan for hermitages, tre for settlements. The old Gaulish language had gone quiet there by late antiquity, but the newcomers brought a Brythonic Celtic speech that survives as Breton. Breton kingdoms formed like a three-part harmony: Domnonay in the north, Cornouaille in the west, and the Vanitais in the southeast. Warrock Chew in the 7th century is remembered enough that a chunk of southeastern Brittany still gets called Brew Warrock in Breton. By the 9th century, Nemenoe, Neveno in Breton, pushed back hard against Frankish kings. In 845 at the Battle of Ballon, he beat Charles the Bold's forces near the River Oust. In 1851, his son Erispo defeated the Franks again at Jengland, after which the Treaty of Angers acknowledged him as King of Brittany and handed over Rennes, Nantes, and the Pays de Retz, Salomon. Saint Salomon of Brittany ruled in the 860s and 870s, straddling alliances and assassinations with the kind of razor edge that came standard with early medieval monarchy. Brittany was not a relic cupboard. It was an independent Celtic kingdom, slamming borders into place while Carolingian rulers stared across hedges. Back in Wales, the dynasties brewed long. Rhodri Mar, the Great, died in 878, after binding Gwynedd, Powys, and Ceredigion under one house through inheritance and war. A century later, Hywel Dda, the Good, who died in 949, or 950, gathered legal customs into a codification remembered as the Laws of Hywel Dda, coins naming him. He wall Rex on pennies, struck at Chester, prove a king with recognized authority to mint and to legislate. Those laws gave women defined rights to property and fosterage practice a legal framework. They read like a pragmatic book for rural life wrapped around a royal spine. Cornwall held a stubborn corner. The British kingdom of Dumnonia shrank under pressure from Wessex, but left behind a king, literally carved in stone. Donied stone, near St. Clear, bears a Latin inscription for Donied Rogavid pro anima, likely referring to Doniath. Rex Cernew, a king of Cornwall, who drowned in 875. Not every royal gets a saga. Some get a rock. And if kingdoms are judged partly by the enemies they knocked over, or at least made sweat, the Celtic polities of the early Middle Ages did fine. Northumbria at its height suffered the permanent wound of Nectansmere in 685. Mercia built Offa's Dyke because Welsh raids and Welsh identity were problems. King Offa chose to solve with 2-3 million cubic meters of moved earth. Anglo-Saxon poets preserved stories of enemies in verse, not because they won every time, but because the frontier shaped them. Vikings turned up to test everybody. Dublin was founded in 841 as a longfort, a shipfort town that became a city. Norse Gaelic dynasts, like Amlaeb Coran, reigned from there, and also, now and then, from York. A Welsh chronicle complains about a black turmoil of men from over the sea. Irish annals count raids, alliances, and intermarriages until Gaelic and Norse fused into a new thing. Gal Gadil, people of mixed ancestry, who would later become the Gallo-Glass elites in a different century. The mystery and rise of the Celtic kingdoms never meant mists and prophecy. It meant the historical fog that rolls in where texts thin out. It meant bog bodies like Lindoman in Cheshire, who died around the 1st century cess by a triple death, strangled, hit, and throat cut, often waved as proof of regular human sacrifice. The caution sign blinks here. Tacitus and Strabo wrote about druidic rites with a lurid gleam, and Caesar describes sacrifices in wicker men. But Roman writers had incentives to paint enemies in horror colors. The archaeology shows ritual deposits of weapons, and sometimes human remains in places like the River Thames or the bogs of northern Europe. It does not show a serial calendar of burning cages. Druids were elites with legal and religious authority. A proscription under Tiberius in Gaul and Suetonius's assault on Anglesey in 60 C show that Rome identified them as a leadership class. Anything beyond that grows speculative whiskers fast. The battlefield image deserves a clean-up too. Woad has a full-body paint job that turned warriors electric blue. Probably belongs on the maybe, but not like that. Shelf. Caesar writes that Britons dyed themselves with woad, vitro, to look more fearsome. The plant's dye stains but also irritates. A light stain or tattoo effect is plausible. Fully smurfed shock troops seem less so. Torques, on the other hand, were absolutely a thing. Heavy neck rings in gold, silver, or bronze that marked status with no ambiguity. The Snettisham hoard in Norfolk, buried around the 1st century Bess, rediscovered in the 20th century, cuffed up several kilograms of gold and silver torques, coils, and rings. Glitter that shows a class, with resources, no matter who was Caesar of anywhere. The Battersea shield, dredged from the Thames, offers red enamel circles bouncing off a polished bronze surface that likely never saw a battlefield, but owned any ritual it attended. Celtic coinage looks like a design industry case study in creative abstraction. Early staters copied Macedonian coins of Philip II. Male head on the obverse, charioteer on the reverse, and promptly mutated them into swirls and crescents that feel modern. Heads turned into floating jaws and hair. Horses became a string of dots and lines. Some coins read as metaphors for motion. British staters of the late 2nd and 1st centuries pushed abstraction so far that some pieces look like sci-fi logos. The names are concrete. Comios, for Comios, of the Atrebates, Sive Nobelin, on gold and silver in Essex and Kent, Tin Comiers and Epels, for Verica's predecessors. Tasciovans for a king whose sons expanded aggressively before Claudius arrived. Underpinning all of these monarchies is an economy that doesn't get enough credit. Hallstatt, salt, and iron in Noricum fueled early kings. Latin elites monopolized alcohol imports and metalwork, then minted coins to wrangle payment systems. In Britain, coin distribution maps match elite territories. In late and post-Roman Western Britain and Ireland, cattle mattered profoundly. Brahon Law's forensic love of cows isn't quirky. It's rational. Irish kingship rituals, the Fais at Tara in later tradition, the inauguration footprint at Dunnad, legitimized rule through community symbolism and sacred geography. In Wales, Hywel's laws balanced rural realities with royal courts. In Brittany, revenues from river valleys and ports flowed into wars that forced Carolingians to sign treaties. These were not mere nostalgia projects for an ancestral culture. They were competitive states. Two pivot moments show just how tough these kingdoms were against the two most dangerous neighbours of their times. In Britain's north, the Pictish win at Dunnecton in 618 and 685 didn't just kill a king. It froze the possibility of a Northumbrian hegemony that might have welded all of Britain together. Centuries early, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says Northumbria's dominion was shorn. In the West, the Welsh reaction to Mercian pressure created a cultural bastion so solid that not even Norman conquest erased it. The Normans eventually built motte and bailey castles across Wales, but Welsh law, poetry and kingship survived, reshaped but present. In Ireland, the Norse entrenched themselves in coastal towns from Dublin to Limerick. Irish kings repurposed those trading hubs instead of letting them become alien enclaves. Brian Boru gets the 1014 spotlight later, but the machinery that lifted him emerges from centuries of Irish kingship, handing out cattle, justice, and battle lines under an older logic. A small parade of solid data points keeps marching across this landscape and pins legend to ground. Atheus of Massalia sailed to Prytannic around 325 BC and described tides and midsummer sun, anchoring Britain in Greek science. Roman geographer Ptolemy in the 2nd century listed tribal names and coordinates in his geography that let modern researchers reconstruct British and Irish maps with eyebrow-raising accuracy. The Annals of Ulster and the Annals of Tigernach record rulers, raids, and eclipses from the 5th century onward. Gildar's cursed contemporary British kings by name in the 6th century, which is both petty and historically useful. Dead's Ecclesiastical History of the English People in 731 preserved stories of Picts, Scots, and Britons, alongside Angles and Saxons. In Britain, Frankish Annals and Breton Vitae together create a mesh that supports the outline of kings like Numenoan and Salomon. In Gaul, Roman inscriptions lay elite names out in stone. In Britain, coin legends shout kingship in Latin letters. In Ireland, Ham slashes the names of real people like Mac Losserin and Marquis Deekt doled out along a cliff path. Myths that need a respectful boot out the door stick around because they scratch an itch. Braveheart-style blue paint from head to toe makes for striking posters. But the body evidence says woad wasn't a full coverage cosmetic. Tartan as a clan uniform is 18th, 19th century phenomenon, born from romance and industry. Iron Age and early medieval textiles in Europe include checks and stripes preserved in salt mines like Hallstatts, but a royal registry of House Mac played. No, 16 inches didn't exist. Druidhood as an all-sacrificing death cult suits Roman invective and some modern horror writing, not the daily job description of a legal religious elite. The Celtic Church, as a noble resistance to Rome, flatters modern identity politics more than it fits the sources. The differences were real but specific and solved by synod. A single Celtic race as a coherent biological group is a 19th century dream that modern genetics politely sets outside. What persisted was language families: Goidelic, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Manx and Brittonic, Welsh Breton, Cornish, and a set of cultural practices flexible enough to survive empire, migration, and Viking beach parties. The hardest myth to kill is disappearance. The Celts did not exit history when a Roman eagle got planted at Richborough in 43, or when a Norman castle went up over Cardiff. The lineage of early Celtic kingdoms threads through later centuries like a bright woven band. Alba in the 10th century turned into Scotland, but its inner life was Gaelic for generations. Wales produced dynasts, like Gruffydd ap Llywelyn in the mid-11th century, who briefly unified almost all Welsh polities before running into Harold Godwinson and fate. Brittany kept its dukes and almost kings until 1532, when a union with France got stitched in by treaty and marriage more than sword. In Ireland, a high kingship kept haunting politics, as Norse town kings and Irish overkings traded tribute and fleets. The English crown arrived in the 12th century and met not leaderless clans, but a layered hierarchy of ree and petty kings, ready to negotiate or throw down. Might needs material culture to flex, and the Celtic kingdoms left plenty. Dumbarton Rock rises with stairs carved into black stone, and cisterns hacked out to hold water under siege. The hill of Tara's earthworks curve over a ridge in County Meath, like ripples of old power. The Pictish sea kings raised fortified promontories at Burghead, where ramparts 7 meters thick dared the Moray Firth to try something. In western Britain, Castell Wyber and Dinas Bran perch on Dragon Ball Z levels of dramatic hilltop, though those are 13th century reflections of an older genius for choosing high ground. In Ireland, the high crosses at Clonmacnoise cut granite sermons into circles and knots. In Brittany, the walled city of Vannes still shows Roman and medieval layers pressed together, while the toponymy whispers the names of early kings in every plough guy and landernau. And then there are the quieter treasures. The Coligny calendar divides the year into months, like Samonios and Gemeonios, and tracks nights rather than days. Mat for good days, and Mat for not so good. Proof of a ghoulish intellectual class mapping time without Roman permission. The Larzak tablet, a long ribbon of 1st century Seled from southern Gaul, preserves a Gaulish text, often read as a legal curse involving women, kinship, and oath. It is messy and magnificent. The Chemalier tablet reads like a supplication to a river god. These are not warrior brag sheets. They are civic texts, If kingship equals sovereignty plus narrative, the Celtic kingdoms wrote their own scripts and kept the props. The Gundestrup cauldron, probably made by Thracian or Balkan craftsmen under Celtic commission, found in a Danish bog, displays warriors, horned figures, and war horns called carnices with boars' heads blaring. Its home in a bog in Jutland, while crafted far to the south, says everything about exchange, mobility, and ritual in this world. The Snettisham talks, the Battersea shield, the Glauberg statue, the Hockdorf couch, the Vix crater, the Dumbarton summit, the Tara ridges, the Offa earthworks. This pile of concrete artifacts makes it difficult to keep treating Celtic polities as background noise between real empires. Every source used to anchor these kings has a personality. Caesar went to war and wrote a resume that got him a dictatorship and a stabby ending. Read his accounts as both data and self-promotion. Strabo liked geography and liked to judge provincial customs from a distance with a Greek smirk. Diodorus Siculus copied earlier writers and tossed in moralizing comments like an ancient op-ed columnist. Polybius chased causes in systems like a political science professor who also likes war. Tacitus wrote whale-scorching prose and a biography of his father-in-law, Agricola, that makes Britons sound brave mostly to make Roman governors sound braver. Bede read the whole archive available to him and then wrote with a clear head and a quiet agenda, and his notes on Edam, Iona, and the Picts land with credibility. Gildas, the 6th century chanter of doom, was annoyed at everyone and wrote to repent kings into behaving, which means names get preserved because someone annoyed him. The annals of Ulster and Tigernach are year-by-year memory palaces, compiled later but anchored to eclipses. Astronomers can verify 664, a solar eclipse. 734, another, which pins them down with math the monks never intended as a citation tool. When modern archaeologists peel back hilltops at sites like South Cadbury, Dunad, Berghead, or Tintagel, their trenches add a new voice to the choir that recorded kingdoms, once without knowing anybody would ever doubt them. The rise of the Celtic kingdoms was never a single upward arrow. It was pulses. A Hallstatt chieftain hands a Greek trader a pile of salted pig tongues and takes a crater in return. A Latin warrior adjusts his mail shirt and pats a talk like a subconscious tick. A Gallic king named Bituitus rides out with painted shield and ends in a Roman prison. A British king stamps KV Nobelin into gold and pours wine at Camulodunum. A client queen named Cartimandua shakes hands with a Roman general and hands over the island's most wanted man. A revolt queen named Boudica puts 3 Roman towns to fire. An Irish king steps onto a stone footprint and takes oaths. A monastic abbot in Iona scratches out a Latin letter, while the Irish monk next to him carves or ham lines on a rock. A Pictish king looks out over a swamp and watches an English army take 1 step too far. A Breton ruler named Nomanoe looks at Frankish tax collectors and decides their day is going to get worse. A Welsh king called Hywel Dda counts cattle and cases and writes a law that keeps mothers and daughters in the text. Mystery and might, paired together, only work as long as the engine underneath the myths gets tuned with facts. The facts, like numbers and objects and named people, slide into place and a shape appears. It looks like local power tuned to a wider world, like trade routes going as deep as identity routes, like kingship that learns to pivot rather than calcify. The Celts who founded Tylis and Galatia proved ambitious range. The Arverni and Aedui proved diplomatic adaptability. The Britons under Cunobelinus and Cartimandua proved royal pragmatism. The Iceni and the Boudica proved terrifying resolve. The Welsh, Picts, Irish, and Bretons proved institutional stamina. No empire lasts forever, but some languages outlast map colours. Welsh is alive in 2026. Breton speaks in markets in Quimper and in songs in Lorient. Irish shouts on Gar sidelines, prints in newspapers, and is carved on street signs across the island. Scottish Gaelic names every loch and glen in the Highlands twice, just to be sure they stick. Cornish came back from a long sleep, dug out of texts and family stories. That is a legacy of kingdoms as much as of poets. It ends, as these stories often do, with a place. A visitor stands at the top of Dumbarton Rock, with wind punching faces and the Clyde scudding grey water below. The basalt is sharp under boots, the stairs are carved by hands that expected sieges, and the little plateau between two peaks holds space for a lost hall. Down in Brittany, the causeway to Mont Saint-Michel sparkles when the tide turns, and on the inland roads, a sign says Cries Brise, Heart of Brittany, in 2 languages. At Tara the grass hums with bees as earthworks run like ribs. Along the hill, on Iona, a carved high cross stands against a sky that changes personality every hour. In each of these places, the past refuses to flatten into costume or cliché. It sticks like salt on skin and metal in museums and names on stones. It says the rise of the Celtic kingdoms was real, plural, and ferociously creative, and it left enough proof behind that nobody has to blink through smoke to see it.